Inferiority Complex. You walk into a room and immediately the comparisons begin. Someone's dressed better. Someone's funnier. Someone just said something clever. And now you're convinced everyone's wondering why you're even here. It's not loud. It's a quiet hum in the back of your mind, whispering that you don't measure up. That feeling, when it becomes permanent, is an inferiority complex. It's the unshakable belief that you are fundamentally less capable, less valuable, less worthy than everyone around you. Not occasional self-doubt, a fixed conviction that colors every interaction, every choice, every moment. The mechanism is vicious. It starts with a single perceived flaw. Maybe you struggled in school while others seemed effortless. Maybe nothing you did was ever quite good enough at home. Maybe someone said something once years ago and it stuck. Whatever the trigger, your mind locks onto it. Treats it as proof of a larger truth, that you are, at your core, deficient. Once that belief takes root, it spreads. You start interpreting neutral events as confirmation. A friend cancels plans. Instead of assuming they're busy, you assume they're avoiding you. A colleague gets promoted. You don't see their achievement. You see proof of your failure. The inferiority complex doesn't need new evidence. It manufactures it. At work, it becomes overcompensation. You stay late, not because the task requires it, but because you're terrified someone will notice you're not doing enough. You apologize for things that don't need apologies. You downplay your successes before anyone else can. In relationships, it creates distance. You assume people are only with you out of pity. You read rejection into silence, abandonment into routine absence. You test loyalty, push boundaries, waiting for the moment they confirm what you already believe, that you were never worth staying for. On social media, it turns into a relentless scorecard. Every post becomes a comparison. Every achievement someone else shares feels like a judgment on your own life. You measure your worth in likes, in follows, in engagement. And when the numbers don't match up, it's not just disappointing. It's proof. Even people who seem to have everything aren't immune. Some of the most accomplished figures in history struggled with profound feelings of inadequacy. They achieved extraordinary things, received recognition, earned respect, and still believed, privately, that they were frauds. That success was luck. That any moment someone would expose them. The psychology runs deeper than insecurity. It's a feedback loop. The more you believe you're inferior, the more you behave in ways that reinforce it. You don't apply for the job because you're sure you won't get it. You don't speak up in meetings because you assume your input doesn't matter. You withdraw before you even try, then use that withdrawal as evidence you were never capable. And here's the cruelest part: other people often don't see it. They see someone competent, talented, capable, but you can't. The inferiority complex won't let you process evidence that contradicts it. Compliments feel hollow. Achievements feel like accidents. Success feels temporary, like it's only a matter of time before everyone realizes you were never qualified. The complex doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like distortion. It feels like clarity. Like you're finally seeing yourself for what you really are. That's what makes it so hard to escape. You're not fighting someone else's judgment. You're fighting your own. Napoleon Complex. There's always one person in the room who turns every conversation into a competition. They interrupt. They dominate. They can't let a single comment pass without asserting their opinion louder, sharper, more aggressively than necessary. It's not confidence. It's overreach. When someone compensates for a perceived inadequacy by projecting dominance and control, that's the Napoleon Complex. The term comes from the belief that Napoleon Bonaparte was short and overcompensated through conquest. Historians actually dispute the height claim. He was average for his time, but the psychological pattern is real. When someone feels small in one dimension, they make themselves larger in others. The mechanism is compensation disguised as strength. Beneath the loud assertions and aggressive posturing is someone who believes they lack something essential. Maybe it's physical stature. Maybe it's social status. Maybe it's respect they feel they've been denied. The inadequacy gnaws at them. Instead of addressing it, they redirect it outward as dominance. At work, it shows up as micromanagement and territorial behavior. The boss who can't delegate because letting go feels like admitting weakness. The colleague who turns every meeting into a power struggle, not because the stakes matter, but because losing even a minor point feels like confirmation of inadequacy. They don't lead. They assert. The aggression isn't proportional to the situation. It's proportional to the insecurity. In relationships, it becomes control and relentless criticism. They can't tolerate being wrong, so they rewrite the narrative. They can't accept vulnerability, so they weaponize it in others. Every disagreement is an opportunity to prove dominance. Compromise feels like defeat. They don't want partnership. They want submission, because only in submission do they feel secure. In social settings, it's the person who dominates conversations with achievements, connections, superiority. Not because they're proud, because silence feels like invisibility. They dismiss others' contributions, react with hostility to any challenge. The louder they are, the smaller they feel inside. History is full of leaders who fit this pattern. Not all were physically small, but many rose to power driven by a deep need to prove something, to dominate, to never be overlooked again. Some channeled it into empire building, others into cruelty. The compensatory drive remained the same. The psychology is paradoxical. The more someone asserts dominance, the more fragile they reveal themselves to be. Real confidence doesn't need constant validation. It doesn't react to minor slights with disproportionate aggression. But the Napoleon Complex can't tolerate ambiguity. Every interaction becomes a test. Failing the test means confronting the inadequacy they've spent so much energy avoiding. Here's what makes it destructive. The behavior alienates the very respect they're trying to earn. People don't admire the aggression. They tolerate it, avoid it, resist it. The overcompensation doesn't build status. It confirms the insecurity. But by that point, the person is locked into the pattern. Backing down feels like admitting weakness. So they double down. More aggressive, more controlling, more isolated. The Napoleon Complex isn't about height. It's about the need to dominate in response to feeling dominated by your own inadequacy. The tragedy is that the harder someone tries to prove they're enough, the more clearly they signal they believe they're not. God Complex. When someone has never been wrong, or at least believes they haven't, a dangerous shift occurs. Criticism stops registering as useful feedback. It becomes noise. Dissent becomes ignorance. Anyone who questions them isn't offering a different perspective. They're simply failing to understand. This is the God Complex, the conviction that you are beyond error, beyond accountability, beyond the ordinary limitations that govern everyone else. It's not confidence in your abilities. It's the belief that your judgment is infallible. The psychology starts with competence. A surgeon makes the right call under pressure and saves a life. A CEO makes a bold decision that turns a company around. A leader navigates a crisis and emerges victorious. Success, especially repeated success in high-stakes situations, starts to feel like proof of superiority. And when you're right often enough, the mind begins to conflate being right with being incapable of being wrong. Expertise accelerates this. The more specialized someone's knowledge, the fewer people can challenge them on equal ground. A doctor knows more about medicine than their patients. An engineer understands systems others don't. A politician operates in complexities most voters never see. The asymmetry creates a feedback loop. Deference from others becomes confirmation of supremacy. Pushback becomes stupidity. In medicine, it shows up as the physician who dismisses patient symptoms because they don't align with the diagnosis already decided. The treatment plan is set. Any contradiction, even from the patient's own experience, is irrelevant. Some of the most catastrophic medical errors come not from lack of knowledge, but from a refusal to consider the possibility of being wrong. In business, it's the executive who surrounds themselves with yes men and interprets every warning as weakness. They mistake boldness for wisdom. Dissent gets framed as disloyalty. The company suffers, but the leader never questions their decisions. They question the people who failed to execute them properly. In politics, it becomes authoritarianism. Leaders who believe they alone understand what the nation needs. They don't govern, they impose. Criticism isn't debate. It's treason. History is littered with rulers who believed their vision was so clear, so righteous, that any resistance was an offense against destiny itself. What makes the God complex so dangerous is that it's often built on real competence. These aren't delusional people stumbling through life. They've achieved things, earned authority, built credibility. But somewhere along the way, the boundary between confidence and infallibility dissolves. They stop updating their beliefs, stop questioning their assumptions. They become unreachable. The irony is that the more someone believes they're beyond error, the more fragile they become. Real strength includes the capacity to be wrong, to adapt, to learn. The God complex removes that capacity. It locks the person into their current understanding, and any deviation from it feels like a threat to their identity. They don't see themselves as arrogant. They see themselves as correct. And that's what makes it nearly impossible to challenge. Because you're not arguing with their conclusion. You're arguing with their fundamental belief that they are incapable of reaching a wrong one. Hero complex. There's a kind of person who needs you to need them. Not because they care about helping. Because they can't feel valuable unless someone depends on them. They don't wait for problems to appear. They create them. Manufacture crises. Then swoop in to save the day. This is the hero complex, the compulsion to rescue others, not out of genuine concern, but because being the savior is the only role where they feel significant. It's not altruism. It's emotional dependency disguised as generosity. The mechanism runs on validation. For someone with a hero complex, self-worth doesn't come from who they are. It comes from being needed. They measure their value by how much others rely on them, how often they're called upon, how indispensable they can make themselves. The moment they're not needed, they feel invisible. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who constantly fixes problems that don't exist. They anticipate issues, magnify small concerns, then present themselves as the solution. It creates a dynamic where the other person is subtly kept dependent. Not because they need help, but because the hero needs to be needed. Any move toward independence feels like rejection. At work, it's the colleague who takes on everyone's tasks, not to be helpful, but to be essential. They volunteer for every crisis. Insert themselves into problems they weren't asked to solve. Then frame their exhaustion as dedication. But underneath the overwork is a deeper fear. If they're not solving something, they're not worth anything. In friendships, it becomes one-sided caregiving. The hero friend is always available, always supportive, always stepping in. But the support isn't reciprocal. They don't want to be helped. They want to be the helper. Because being on the receiving end means admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability contradicts the identity they've built around being strong for others. The psychology is paradoxical. The hero complex looks like selflessness, but it's deeply self-centered. It's not about what the other person needs. It's about what the hero needs from the act of helping. True support empowers people to solve their own problems. The hero complex keeps them dependent, because independence means the hero loses their purpose. And here's the trap. People with hero complexes often attract those who need rescuing. Not because they seek out healthy relationships, but because they unconsciously gravitate toward situations where they can play the savior. They don't want equals. They want projects, someone to fix, Someone who validates their identity by staying broken. The damage isn't always obvious. The hero seems generous, caring, self-sacrificing, but over time, the people around them don't grow. They stagnate. Because growth means needing less help, and needing less help threatens the hero's entire sense of self. The hero complex isn't about saving people. It's about saving yourself from the terror of being ordinary. And the cost is that no one around you gets to be strong. Messiah Complex. Imagine believing you're the only one who can save the world. Not metaphorically, not as motivation, but as unshakable conviction. That you've been chosen, that the truth has been revealed to you and only you, that everyone else is asleep and you alone are awake. This is the Messiah Complex, a delusional belief that you are destined to rescue humanity from itself. It's not ambition. It's not leadership. It's grandiosity so extreme that the boundary between vision and megalomania disappears entirely. The psychology begins with a kernel of insight. Someone notices a problem others overlook, a social injustice, a failing system, a blind spot in collective thinking. They're right. The problem is real, but instead of working within reality to address it, they interpret their awareness as proof of divine selection. They're not just observant. They're chosen. This belief becomes self-reinforcing. Resistance isn't disagreement. It's confirmation. Because of course people would resist. Of course they'd reject the truth. That's what always happens to prophets, to revolutionaries, to the enlightened few who see beyond the veil. Opposition doesn't challenge the belief. It strengthens it. History is full of figures who embodied this pattern. Cult leaders who convinced followers they alone held the key to salvation. Revolutionary leaders who justified mass violence as necessary for the greater vision only they could see. Ideologues so certain of their righteousness that any atrocity could be rationalized as a step toward the promised transformation. Jim Jones believed he was leading his followers to utopia. He ended up leading them to mass suicide. David Koresh convinced people he was the final prophet. The conviction led to a deadly standoff. These weren't isolated cases. They're what happens when the Messiah Complex reaches its extreme. The person becomes so consumed by the vision that reality itself becomes negotiable. But the Messiah Complex doesn't only appear in cults. It shows up in activism, in entrepreneurship, in any domain where someone becomes so convinced of their mission that they stop listening. The tech founder who believes their app will save civilization. The political radical who sees violence as justified because they're on the right side of history. The reformer who burns down institutions because they're certain they know what should replace them. The danger isn't in wanting to make the world better. It's in believing you're uniquely equipped to do so. That your vision is so clear, so righteous, that any method becomes acceptable. That people who disagree aren't offering valid perspectives. They're obstacles. What separates genuine leadership from the Messiah Complex is humility. Real leaders understand they might be wrong. They listen. They adapt. They recognize that change requires collaboration, not domination. The Messiah Complex removes that capacity. It replaces dialogue with decree, cooperation with compliance, influence with control. And here's the cruelest irony: the more someone believes they're saving the world, the more destruction they often cause. Because salvation, in their mind, justifies anything. Lies, manipulation, violence, all become tools in service of the greater good. But the greater good, defined solely by the Messiah, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. The Messiah Complex doesn't save anyone. It consumes them. And the person most trapped by it is the one who believes they're free. Martyr Complex. Some people wear their suffering like a badge. They don't just experience hardship. They perform it. Every conversation becomes a catalogue of sacrifices. Every inconvenience, a testimony to how much they endure. And beneath the complaints is a single message: look what I've done for you. Look what you owe me. This is the Martyr Complex, the psychological pattern where someone uses their suffering as a tool for control. It's not about actual hardship. It's about weaponizing pain to create guilt, obligation, and power. The mechanism is manipulation disguised as selflessness. A parent reminds their child constantly of everything they gave up to raise them. A partner lists every sacrifice they've made, turning generosity into debt. A coworker stays late, suffers through extra work, then ensures everyone knows how much they're struggling. The suffering becomes currency, and the payment demanded is deference. In families, it's the parent who reminds you of every sacrifice, the opportunities they passed up, the dreams they abandoned, the life they could have had if not for you. They don't say it to share, they say it to bind, to make sure you never forget what you cost them. Every decision you make that doesn't center their needs becomes ingratitude. Every boundary you set becomes betrayal. In relationships, it shows up as scorekeeping disguised as love. The partner who does things you didn't ask for, then holds them over you. They clean the house not because they want to, but so they can remind you later. They make compromises, then weaponize them in arguments. They turn every act of care into a transaction, and they're always keeping track of who owes whom. At work, it's the employee who takes on excessive responsibility, then broadcasts their exhaustion. They stay late, skip lunch, work weekends. Not because the job requires it, but because the performance of suffering earns them moral authority. They can't be criticized. They're too busy sacrificing. Any feedback becomes cruelty, because how dare you question someone who's already giving so much? The psychology runs on guilt. Martyrs don't want solutions. They want acknowledgement. Offer to help, and they'll refuse. Suggest they do less, and they'll insist they have no choice. Because the goal isn't relief. It's leverage. As long as they're suffering, they hold power. They become the moral center, the one everyone else revolves around, the one who can never be wrong because they've already paid the price. History shows this pattern at scale. Leaders who frame their tyranny as burden. Dictators who claim they didn't want power, but sacrificed themselves to save the nation. Movements that justify cruelty by positioning themselves as victims fighting back. The martyr narrative becomes a shield. Accountability dissolves. Criticism becomes persecution. What makes the Martyr Complex so insidious is that it looks like virtue. Sacrifice is admirable. Endurance is respected. But the Martyr Complex perverts both. It turns suffering into performance and generosity into coercion. It's not about giving. It's about ensuring everyone knows the cost. The difference between real sacrifice and the Martyr Complex is intent. Genuine sacrifice is quiet. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't turn care into obligation. The Martyr Complex does all of that. It takes every act of giving and transforms it into a chain. And the cruelest part is that the people around martyrs can never do enough. Because the goal isn't resolution. It's perpetual debt. No matter how much you acknowledge their suffering, how much you try to repay them, it's never sufficient. The martyr needs the suffering to continue because without it, they lose their power. The Martyr Complex doesn't honor sacrifice. It exploits it. And the person most trapped by it is often the one performing it. Madonna-Whore Complex. Some men divide women into two categories, saints and sinners, Madonnas and whores. One type is pure virtuous, worthy of respect. The other is sexual, desirable, but fundamentally degraded. No woman gets to be both. No woman gets to be whole. This is the Madonna-Whore Complex, a psychological split where men can't reconcile sexuality with respect. A woman can be admired or desired, but never simultaneously. The moment she becomes sexual, she loses her virtue. The moment she's virtuous, she becomes untouchable. The psychology goes back centuries. Religion positioned women as either the Virgin Mary or Eve. Literature gave us the innocent maiden versus the temptress. Culture built an entire architecture around the idea that female sexuality and female worth are incompatible. And for men who internalize this, every woman they encounter gets sorted into one box or the other. In dating, it shows up as the man who pursues women he's attracted to, but can't respect them. The relationship is purely physical. He enjoys it, but he'd never introduce her to his family. She's not the type you marry. Then there's the woman he respects. She's kind, intelligent, nurturing. But he can't feel desire. The relationship becomes sexless, or he starts looking elsewhere for what he won't allow himself to want from her. In marriage, it becomes a trap. The wife who was once desirable becomes the mother of his children. And in his mind, mothers aren't sexual. She's elevated to sainthood, which means she's no longer a woman he can want. Desire gets redirected to someone else, someone he can't respect. The wife gets reverence, the affair gets passion, and the man never questions why he can't feel both for the same person. In broader culture, it's everywhere. The virgin-whore dichotomy shows up in film, music, advertising. Women are either innocent or corrupted, chaste or promiscuous. The fantasy or the reality. There's no space for complexity. No room for a woman to be sexual and dignified, desirable and respectable, human and whole. The damage isn't just relational, it's psychological. Women internalize the split. They learn that expressing sexuality means losing respectability. That being desirable makes them less serious. That they have to choose between being wanted and being valued. The complex doesn't just limit how men see women. It limits how women see themselves. And here's the cruelty: the Madonna-Whore Complex punishes women for being fully human. It denies them complexity, reduces them to caricatures, then blames them for not fitting into boxes that were never designed to hold real people. The psychology isn't about women. It's about the man's inability to integrate his own desires with his need for purity. He splits women into categories because he can't reconcile the contradiction within himself. And the cost of that failure is that no woman in his life ever gets to be real. Cinderella Complex. Waiting for someone to rescue you feels easier than rescuing yourself. Easier to believe that the right person will come along and fix everything. The job. The loneliness. The dissatisfaction. You don't have to take action. You just have to wait. And hope. And stay exactly where you are until someone notices you're worth saving. This is the Cinderella Complex, the unconscious desire to be taken care of, to avoid independence, to let someone else be responsible for your life. It's not about wanting partnership. It's about needing dependency. The psychology is rooted in avoidance. Independence is terrifying. It means risk. It means the possibility of failure. It means no one to blame if things go wrong. Dependency, on the other hand, offers safety. Someone else makes the decisions. Someone else takes the financial burden. Someone else carries the weight. And if it doesn't work out, it's their fault, not yours. In relationships, it shows up as the person who won't build a life until someone builds it for them. They don't pursue careers because they're waiting for a partner who'll provide. They don't make major decisions because they assume someone else will. The relationship becomes a rescue fantasy, not a partnership. A salvation. Financially, it's the refusal to develop independence. No savings. No career investment. No long-term planning. Because the narrative is that someone will come along and handle it. The fairy tale promised a prince. The modern version promises a partner who'll take care of everything. And while waiting, the person's own capacity for self-sufficiency atrophies. Emotionally, it becomes learned helplessness. Problems don't get solved. They get endured until someone else solves them. Challenges don't get faced. They get avoided until someone else steps in. The person becomes passive in their own life, waiting for external rescue instead of building internal strength. The fairy tale itself is part of the problem. Cinderella didn't save herself. She waited. Endured. and was rewarded when a prince noticed her. The story teaches that passivity and beauty are enough, that suffering will be seen and rewarded, that the right person will come and change everything. And for people who internalize that narrative, life becomes an endless waiting room. But reality doesn't work that way. No one is coming. No prince, no savior, no perfect partner who'll fix your life while you stay still. Waiting doesn't build anything. It just prolongs dependence. And the longer someone waits, the harder it becomes to start. The Cinderella Complex isn't about romance. It's about refusing to be the protagonist of your own life. It's choosing passivity over agency, dependency over autonomy, waiting over building. And the cost is that you never become the person who could save yourself. Electra Complex. What happens when a daughter's first love is her father, and she never moves past it? When every man she meets gets measured against him. When approval from men becomes more important than her own judgment. When she's still seeking validation from the first man who mattered, even decades later. This is the Electra Complex, the term psychoanalysts use for a daughter's excessive attachment to her father and the unconscious rivalry with her mother. It's the female counterpart to the Oedipus Complex, and while the theory comes from Freud, the pattern shows up in real behavior, not as literal desire, but as a psychological template that shapes how a woman relates to men for the rest of her life. The psychology centers on early attachment. In childhood, a daughter may idolize her father. He's strong, protective, the first man she loves. That's normal. But if that attachment doesn't mature, if it stays frozen in childhood dynamics, it becomes a template. She doesn't grow out of needing his approval. She just transfers that need to every man she meets. In dating, it shows up as a pattern. She's attracted to older men, men in positions of authority. Men who resemble her father in temperament, status, or behavior. Not because she's consciously seeking her father, but because the psychological blueprint is set. The template for what a man should be was written early, and it never got updated. In relationships, it becomes competition. If she's still emotionally tethered to her father, her romantic partner becomes a rival for her attention and loyalty. She can't fully commit because part of her is still seeking her father's approval. Or she resents her partner for not measuring up to the idealized version of masculinity her father represents. In adulthood, it's the woman who can't make a major decision without her father's input. Career. Marriage. Where to live. She's financially independent, professionally successful, but emotionally, she's still the daughter seeking validation. His opinion carries more weight than her own. His approval matters more than her partner's. And any criticism from him feels like devastation. The Electra Complex isn't about desire. It's about arrested development. The daughter never fully separates. She stays psychologically bound to the father, which prevents her from forming mature, independent relationships. She's not looking for a partner. She's looking for a replacement, someone who'll give her what she's still trying to get from her father: unconditional approval, protection, validation. And here's the trap: no partner can provide that. Because what she's seeking isn't adult love. It's the childhood security she never outgrew. And as long as she's searching for her father in every man she meets, she'll never find someone who's simply himself. The Electra Complex doesn't honor the father. It traps the daughter in a dynamic she should have outgrown. And the cost is a lifetime of relationships where no man is ever quite enough, because they're all being measured against an impossible standard. Oedipus Complex. The son who can't separate from his mother becomes the man who can't commit to anyone else. Every woman he dates gets compared to her. Every relationship ends because no one measures up. He doesn't see it as a problem. He sees his mother as exceptional, and every partner as inadequate. This is the Oedipus Complex, the term Freud used to describe a son's unconscious attachment to his mother and the rivalry with his father. The theory is contentious. The pattern, however, is real. Not as literal desire, but as an emotional entanglement that prevents the son from becoming an independent adult. The psychology begins with dependency. In childhood, the mother is the primary caregiver. The source of comfort, attention, security. That's normal. But if the son never separates, if the mother never lets go, or if the father is absent or weak, the attachment becomes pathological. The son stays emotionally fused with the mother, and that fusion becomes the template for every relationship that follows. In adulthood, it's the man who calls his mother daily, asks her opinion on everything, prioritizes her needs over his partner's. He's not just close to his mother, he's enmeshed. His identity is still built around being her son, and any woman he's with becomes an outsider to that bond. In relationships, it creates an impossible dynamic. The partner isn't competing with an ex. She's competing with his mother. And she can't win, because the mother represents unconditional love, childhood security, the woman who's always been there. The partner represents adulthood, compromise, the reality that he's supposed to be building a life separate from his family of origin. The mother-son bond, when it's healthy, evolves. The son grows up, separates, and forms his own attachments. The mother steps back and lets him become independent. But when the Oedipus Complex is active, neither party lets go. The mother stays central. The son stays dependent. And any romantic relationship becomes a threat to that bond. It shows up in 1,000 small ways. He tells his mother things he won't tell his partner. He spends holidays prioritizing her needs. He takes her side in conflicts. He makes major life decisions based on what she wants, not what he and his partner need. The relationship doesn't feel like a partnership. It feels like the partner is dating both of them. And here's the cruelty: the son often doesn't see the problem. He frames it as being a good son, respecting his mother, honoring the woman who raised him. But respect doesn't require fusion. Honor doesn't require dependency. And being a good son shouldn't mean being a bad partner. The Oedipus Complex doesn't strengthen the mother-son bond. It distorts it. The son never becomes a fully independent adult. The mother never lets him go. And every romantic relationship becomes collateral damage in a dynamic that should have ended decades ago. Victim complex. Everything that goes wrong is someone else's fault. The job you didn't get, the relationship that ended, the opportunity that passed. It's never about your choices. It's always about what was done to you. You're not failing. You're being sabotaged. You're not responsible. You're a victim. This is the victim complex, the psychological pattern where someone adopts victimhood as their core identity. It's not about experiencing harm. Everyone experiences harm. It's about building your entire sense of self around the belief that you are perpetually wronged, perpetually powerless, and perpetually entitled to sympathy because of it. The psychology is self-reinforcing. Victimhood offers a powerful payoff. It absolves you of responsibility. If you're the victim, nothing is your fault. It grants moral authority. Victims can't be criticized. Any pushback becomes further proof of persecution. And it guarantees attention. People sympathize with victims. They rally around them. The victim complex turns suffering into currency. At work, it's the employee who blames every failure on bias, politics, unfair treatment. They didn't get the promotion because the boss's favorites. The project failed because no one supported them. The feedback was unjust because people don't understand their value. There's always an external cause, never an internal one. In relationships, it becomes emotional manipulation. Every conflict is framed as an attack. Every boundary is framed as rejection. The partner can't express a need because it gets reframed as cruelty. The victim complex turns normal relationship dynamics into a courtroom where one person is always the defendant and the other is always the injured party. On social media, it's the person who curates their suffering for an audience. Every setback becomes a public grievance. Every challenge becomes evidence of systemic injustice. The narrative is always the same. The world is against me, and I'm brave for surviving it. The performance earns validation, and the validation reinforces the identity. In politics and culture, the victim complex scales. Groups adopt it. Movements weaponize it. Victimhood becomes a shield against accountability and a sword against criticism. Any questioning becomes oppression. Any disagreement becomes violence. The complexity of reality collapses into a simple narrative: we are victims and they are oppressors. The damage runs deep. People with a victim complex can't grow. Growth requires acknowledging mistakes, taking responsibility, adapting. But the victim identity forbids all of that. Because if you admit fault, you lose the moral high ground. If you take responsibility, you can't blame others. If you change, you can't keep claiming the world is unchangeably against you. And here's the trap: the victim complex creates the very isolation it claims to suffer from. People get exhausted. They offer support, and it's never enough. They offer solutions, and they're dismissed. Eventually, they stop trying. And the person with the victim complex doesn't see their role in that. They just see more evidence that everyone abandons them. The victim complex doesn't protect you from harm. It traps you in it. Because as long as your identity is built on being wronged, you can never move past it. And the world stops being a place where you have agency. It becomes a place where things are only ever done to you. Savior complex. Helping people feels good. But for some, it's not about the help. It's about the feeling, the validation, the identity. They don't help because someone needs it. They help because they need to be needed. And the moment you stop needing them, they're gone. This is the savior complex, closely related to the hero complex, but with a broader reach. It's the compulsion to rescue, fix, and save others, not out of compassion, but because being the savior is the only role where they feel valuable. It's ego dressed as altruism. The psychology runs on superiority disguised as service. The savior sees themselves as uniquely capable, uniquely enlightened, uniquely positioned to help those less fortunate. They don't see equals. They see projects. People who need saving. And in saving them, the savior confirms their own importance. In charity work, it shows up as the volunteer who helps, but needs everyone to know they're helping. They post every act of service, frame themselves as heroes. The work isn't about the people being served. It's about the savior's image. They're not building sustainable solutions. They're collecting proof of their own goodness. In relationships, it becomes condescension. The savior chooses partners they perceive as broken. Someone struggling financially, someone dealing with trauma, someone who seems to need rescue. The relationship isn't a partnership. It's a rehabilitation project. And the moment the partner starts to heal, starts to need less, the savior loses interest. Because they don't want an equal. They want someone who'll validate their superiority by staying dependent. In professional settings, it's the person who inserts themselves into every crisis. Not because they're qualified, but because they need to be the one who solves it. They don't delegate. They don't empower. They rescue. And in doing so, they keep people dependent, because independence would make the savior unnecessary. The white savior complex is a particular manifestation. The outsider who enters a community they don't understand, assumes they know what's needed, and implements solutions that often do more harm than good. It's not about listening to the people they claim to help. It's about confirming their own narrative as the enlightened rescuer bringing salvation to the helpless. The communities don't need saving. They need resources, respect, and autonomy. But the savior complex can't accept that, because it would mean stepping back instead of stepping in. What makes the savior complex dangerous is that it looks like virtue. The savior works hard, sacrifices time, gives money. But the motivation isn't compassion, it's narcissism. They're not serving others. They're serving their own need to feel superior, necessary, indispensable. And here's the damagix: the Savior Complex doesn't actually help people. It keeps them small. It reinforces the idea that they can't solve their own problems, that they need someone else to step in. True help empowers. It builds capacity. It steps back when the person is ready to stand on their own. The Savior Complex does the opposite. It keeps people dependent, because independence would make the Savior obsolete. The Savior Complex isn't about saving anyone. It's about saving yourself from the fear that without a mission, without people who need you, you're ordinary. And ordinary doesn't feel like enough. Superiority Complex. Some people don't just think they're good at something. They think they're better than everyone. Not in one area. In everything. Their taste is more refined. Their intelligence is sharper. Their judgment is superior. And anyone who doesn't recognize that is simply too inferior to understand. This is the Superiority Complex, the unshakable belief that you exist on a higher plane than the people around you. It's not confidence. It's condescension dressed as self-awareness. The person with a superiority complex doesn't just value their own abilities. They devalue everyone else's. The psychology has two possible origins. Sometimes it's overcompensation. Beneath the arrogance is deep insecurity, and the superiority act is a defense mechanism. The person feels small, so they make themselves large by diminishing others. But sometimes it's simpler than that. Sometimes people are just raised to believe they're exceptional, told they're gifted, given every advantage, and they internalize it as proof that they're fundamentally better. In intellectual circles, it shows up as the person who can't have a conversation without correcting you. They don't engage with ideas. They rank them. Yours is always lacking. Theirs is always more sophisticated. They don't debate. They condescend. Every interaction becomes a performance of their superiority, and you're just the audience. In social settings, it's the person who treats service workers with contempt, dismisses people from different backgrounds, and surrounds themselves only with those they deem worthy. Not because they're consciously cruel, but because they genuinely believe some people matter more than others. And they've placed themselves at the top. In professional environments, it becomes impossible to work with. The person with a superiority complex doesn't collaborate. They dominate. They don't listen to feedback because they don't believe anyone is qualified to give it. They don't learn from mistakes because they don't believe they make them. Every failure gets blamed on someone else's incompetence. Cultural elitism is a collective form of this. The assumption that certain tastes, certain educations, certain lifestyles are simply better. Not different. Better. The person who looks down on popular culture, who dismisses entire groups as unsophisticated, who believes their preferences are a mark of intelligence, rather than just preference. It's superiority scaled up and socially acceptable. What makes the superiority complex so isolating is that it prevents real connection. You can't connect with someone you see as beneath you. You can't learn from someone you've already dismissed. The person with a superiority complex surrounds themselves with admirers or subordinates, but never equals. Because equality would require admitting that other people have value independent of their usefulness, or their recognition of your greatness. And here's the irony: the more someone insists on their superiority, the more fragile they reveal themselves to be. Real excellence doesn't need constant assertion. It doesn't need to diminish others to shine. The superiority complex isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign that the person's sense of worth is so unstable that it requires everyone else to be lesser just to hold it up. The superiority complex doesn't elevate anyone. It just ensures that the person holding it will spend their life alone on a pedestal they built themselves, wondering why no one wants to climb up and join them. Abandonment Complex. The fear that everyone will leave isn't just anxiety, it's certainty. You know deep down that no matter how close someone seems, no matter how much they say they care, they'll eventually go. So you watch for signs. Test their loyalty. Push them away before they can leave on their own terms. And when they finally do leave, it's not a surprise. It's confirmation. This is the Abandonment Complex, the core belief that you are fundamentally unworthy of being stayed for. It's not about one person leaving. It's about the expectation that everyone will, and that expectation shapes everything. The psychology often begins early. A parent who left. A caregiver who was inconsistent. A childhood where love felt conditional or unreliable. The brain learns a pattern attachment leads to loss. And once that pattern is set, it becomes a filter. Every relationship gets interpreted through it. Closeness becomes dangerous because it means the abandonment, when it comes, will hurt more. In romantic relationships, it shows up as constant testing. The person needs reassurance, but no amount is ever enough. They read into every late text, every cancelled plan, every moment of distance. Not because the evidence is there, but because they're waiting for it. And when the partner gets exhausted by the constant suspicion and pulls away, it's not seen as a response to the behavior. It's seen as proof that they were going to leave anyway. In friendships, it becomes a preemptive strike. The person with an abandonment complex often ends relationships before they can be ended. Not because they want to, but because leaving first feels safer than being left. They withdraw, create distance, sabotage the connection. Then, when the friend stops reaching out, they interpret it as abandonment. They don't see their own role in creating the outcome they feared. In families, it can look like clinging or extreme independence. Either the person becomes overly dependent, terrified of any separation, or they reject attachment entirely. They convince themselves they don't need anyone, that self-sufficiency is safer than risking loss. But beneath the independence is the same fear: if I let someone matter, they'll leave. Attachment theory explains part of this. Early inconsistent caregiving creates what's called an anxious attachment style. The person learns that love is unpredictable, that people come and go, that safety doesn't exist. And as an adult, they bring that into every relationship, scanning for threats, unable to trust stability even when it's offered. The cruelest part is that the abandonment complex creates the very outcome it fears. The constant need for reassurance exhausts people. The testing pushes them away. The preemptive rejection ensures they leave. And each time it happens, it reinforces the belief. They don't see that they're engineering the abandonment. They just see that, once again, someone left. The abandonment complex doesn't protect you from loss. It guarantees it. Because the fear becomes so overwhelming that the relationship can't survive under the weight of it. And the person is left alone, convinced it was inevitable, never realizing they built the cage themselves. Persecution complex. When you believe the world is against you, every neutral event becomes evidence. Someone didn't respond to your email. They're ignoring you. A colleague got promoted. They're conspiring to hold you back. A friend made plans without you. They're deliberately excluding you. It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And the pattern is clear. Everyone is out to get you. This is the persecution complex, the belief that you are being systematically targeted, attacked, or undermined by others. It's not based on isolated incidents. It's a worldview. Every interaction gets filtered through the assumption of malice. And once you're convinced the world is hostile, you find hostility everywhere. The psychology is self-reinforcing. Persecution complexes often start with real experiences of mistreatment, bullying, discrimination, genuine harm. But instead of processing those experiences as specific events, the person generalizes them into a permanent state. They were wronged once. Now they're always being wronged. The past becomes a lens that distorts the present. At work, it's the employee who interprets every piece of feedback as a personal attack. Constructive criticism becomes persecution. Being passed over for a project becomes sabotage. Colleagues aren't just co-workers. They're adversaries. The person sees plots, alliances, schemes. And because they're constantly on the defensive, they create conflict where none existed. People start avoiding them, which only confirms the belief that they're being targeted. On social media, it becomes a performance. Every disagreement is framed as harassment. Every critique is an attack. The person curates their suffering, presenting themselves as under constant siege. And the audience, at least initially, offers sympathy. But over time, people notice the pattern. Every situation, no matter how minor, gets escalated into persecution. And the sympathy turns into skepticism. In politics, the persecution complex scales dangerously. Leaders who frame every criticism as a conspiracy. Movements that interpret all opposition as existential threat. Entire groups convinced that the world is aligned against them, which justifies extreme responses. The persecution narrative becomes a tool. It unifies people. It excuses aggression, because if you're being persecuted, any defense is justified. History is full of leaders who wielded persecution complexes to devastating effect. They convinced their followers that they were under attack, that enemies surrounded them, that survival required ruthless action. The complexes weren't just personal. They became political weapons. And millions suffered because someone's distorted perception of threat became policy. What makes the persecution complex so destructive is that it's unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it gets reinterpreted as proof. If people are kind, they're being manipulative. If they're distant, they're hostile. If they explain themselves, they're gaslighting. The complex creates a closed loop where the person can never be wrong about being persecuted, because everything confirms it. And here's the trap: the persecution complex eventually creates real persecution. The constant accusations, the defensiveness, the hostility, it wears people down. They start avoiding the person, excluding them, treating them carefully, which gets interpreted as insincerity. The isolation the person feared becomes real. But it's not because the world was against them. It's because they made themselves impossible to be around. The persecution complex doesn't reveal enemies. It creates them. And the person ends up alone, convinced they were right all along, never realizing they built the walls themselves. Mother Complex. Your mother's voice never leaves. It's there when you make decisions, when you judge yourself, when you look in the mirror. It's not always her actual words. Sometimes it's what you think she would say, what you imagine she expects, what you believe she needs from you. You're an adult. You've moved out. Built your own life. But emotionally, you're still trying to earn her approval, escape her criticism, or prove her wrong. This is the mother complex, a term from Jungian psychology describing the excessive influence of the mother figure on a person's psyche. It's not about loving your mother. It's about being unable to separate from her psychological presence. She doesn't have to be physically present. She's internalized, and that internalized version shapes everything. The psychology shows up differently depending on gender and the type of relationship. For some, the mother complex manifests as idealization. The mother is perfect. No partner will ever measure up. No relationship will ever recreate the unconditional love, real or imagined, that the mother provided. For others, it's the opposite. The mother is the source of all pain, and every relationship becomes an attempt to escape or repair what she damaged. In women, it can show up as competition. The daughter measures herself against the mother, either trying to surpass her or feeling she never will. If the mother was nurturing, the daughter may struggle to see herself as capable of the same warmth. If the mother was critical, the daughter internalizes that criticism and becomes her own harshest judge. Either way, the mother's presence, real or imagined, never fades. In men, it often shows up in romantic relationships. The man seeks a partner who resembles his mother, consciously or not. Or he seeks the opposite, rejecting any trait that reminds him of her. Either way, the mother remains the template. He's not choosing a partner based on who they are. He's choosing based on how they relate to the maternal archetype he carries. Jung described the mother complex as having both positive and negative poles. The positive mother complex can create nurturing, empathetic, deeply caring individuals. But it can also create dependency, an inability to function without external care. The negative mother complex can drive independence, ambition, the need to prove oneself. But it can also create coldness, emotional unavailability, the inability to trust intimacy. In daily life, it's the person who calls their mother for every decision. Or the person who never calls her, but still hears her voice in their head, criticizing every choice. It's the woman who can't feel beautiful because her mother always commented on her weight. The man who can't commit because his mother's neediness taught him that closeness means suffocation. What makes the mother complex so powerful is that the mother is the first relationship, the first attachment, the first source of love, or the first source of pain. And that initial imprint is hard to overwrite. Even when the person knows intellectually that they're repeating patterns, the emotional pull remains. The mother complex doesn't honor the mother. It traps both parties. The child never becomes fully independent. The mother, real or imagined, remains frozen in the role, unable to evolve. And every relationship the person forms is shadowed by a presence that can't be escaped because it was never external to begin with. It's inside. And until it's confronted, it stays there, shaping everything. Father complex. Living in someone's shadow is one thing. Living in your father's shadow is another. Because the shadow doesn't just block the light. It defines the shape you're supposed to take. You become what he was, or you become what he wasn't. Either way, you're not becoming yourself. This is the father complex, the overwhelming influence of the father figure on a person's identity, values, and sense of self. It's the internalized father, the voice of authority, judgment, expectation. And it doesn't matter if your father was present or absent, supportive or harsh. The complex forms either way. The psychology centers on authority. In Jungian terms, the father represents order, structure, societal rules. He's the bridge between the inner world of family and the outer world of society. And how a person relates to their father often determines how they relate to authority in general. Bosses, laws, institutions. The father complex doesn't stay in the family. It extends outward. For some, the father complex manifests as submission. The person spends their life seeking approval from authority figures, trying to live up to an impossible standard. They choose careers their father would respect, partners he would approve of, lives that reflect his values, not theirs. They're successful by conventional measures, but they're not living their own life. They're living the one they think he wanted for them. For others, it's rebellion. The father was controlling, absent, abusive, or simply disappointing. And the person spends their life doing the opposite of what he would want. They reject his values, his career, his lifestyle. But the rejection is still a response to him. They're not free. They're just moving in the opposite direction, still defined by the relationship they're trying to escape. In women, the father complex often shows up in romantic choices. The woman seeks men who resemble her father, recreating familiar dynamics even when they're unhealthy. Or she seeks men who are nothing like him, running from the traits she learned to associate with masculinity. Either way, the father remains the template. She's not choosing based on compatibility. She's choosing based on the ghost of the first man in her life. In men, it's often a question of identity. Can he ever be as successful as his father? Does he want to be? If the father was absent, the son grows up without a model for manhood and either fills the void with cultural stereotypes or rejects the concept entirely. If the father was overbearing, the son spends his life either trying to earn approval or proving he doesn't need it. The father complex also shows up in how people handle power. Those with unresolved father complexes often struggle with authority. They either submit too easily or resist automatically. They can't work for a boss without transferring all their father issues onto the relationship. They can't accept guidance without feeling controlled. They can't assert themselves without feeling like they're betraying the internalized father. What makes the father complex so insidious is that the father, as an archetype, represents the internalized voice of judgment. It's the part of you that says you're not good enough, not successful enough, not strong enough. And for people with a strong father complex, that voice is loud. It doesn't matter if their actual father was kind. The complex isn't about the real person. It's about the internalized authority figure that never stops evaluating. The father complex doesn't create strength. It creates a life lived in response to someone else's expectations. And the person never becomes who they could be, because they're too busy trying to be who they think he wanted, or who he didn't want, or anything that keeps them tethered to a relationship that should have evolved into something else decades ago. Guilt complex. Carrying guilt for things that aren't your fault becomes normal after a while. You apologize when someone bumps into you. You feel responsible when a friend is upset, even when their mood has nothing to do with you. You replay conversations looking for what you did wrong. And even when you can't find it, the guilt remains. Because somewhere, somehow, it must be your fault. This is the guilt complex, the irrational, pervasive sense that you are responsible for harm, even when you're not. It's not about actual wrongdoing. It's about carrying the weight of responsibility for things outside your control. And the weight never lightens. It just accumulates. The psychology often begins in childhood. Maybe you grew up in a household where you were blamed for things that weren't your fault. A parent's bad mood, a sibling's misbehavior, the family's financial stress. Children absorb blame easily. They don't have the capacity to recognize when responsibility is being misplaced. They just internalize it. And that becomes the template. Or maybe it's religious. Certain traditions emphasize inherent sinfulness, unworthiness, the idea that you're born guilty and must spend your life atoning. The guilt isn't tied to specific actions. It's existential. You're guilty for existing. And that belief, internalized early, becomes a lens through which everything is filtered. Survivor's guilt is a specific, acute form. The person who survived an accident, a disaster, a tragedy that others didn't. Logically, they know survival wasn't their choice. But emotionally, they feel responsible. They lived. Others didn't. And the guilt becomes a constant companion, a belief that their survival was somehow undeserved, that they should have been the one who died instead. In families, it shows up as the person who feels responsible for everyone's happiness. The child who mediates their parents' fights. The sibling who takes care of everyone else. The adult who can't set boundaries because saying no feels like causing harm. They don't help because they want to. They help because not helping would trigger unbearable guilt. In relationships, the guilt complex makes people easy to manipulate. They apologize for things they didn't do. They accept blame to keep the peace. Their partner learns that guilt is a lever. Use it, and the person will comply. And the person with the guilt complex doesn't see the manipulation. They just see their own failure to be good enough, kind enough, selfless enough. At work, it's the employee who feels guilty for taking time off, for saying no to extra projects, for not being available at all hours. They're not motivated by passion. They're motivated by fear. Fear that if they don't do everything, they're failing. And failing, to someone with a guilt complex, feels like a moral crime. What makes the guilt complex so destructive is that it's self-sustaining. The person feels guilty, so they overcompensate. They give too much, sacrifice too much, accept too much blame. And when that leads to resentment or burnout, they feel guilty about that too. The cycle doesn't end. It just deepens. And here's the cruelty. People with guilt complexes are often surrounded by people who exploit it. Because if you know someone will always take the blame, always apologize, always try to fix things, You can offload your own responsibility onto them, and they'll accept it. Because for them, guilt isn't an emotion. It's an identity. The guilt complex doesn't make you a better person. It makes you a target, and the weight you carry isn't justice. It's just weight. But until you learn to put it down, it stays. And you keep carrying guilt that was never yours to begin with. Shame complex. You replay the moment over and over. What you said. How you looked. The way people reacted. It was years ago. No one else remembers. But you do. And every time it surfaces, the feeling is the same. Not embarrassment. Shame. The deep, visceral belief that something about you is fundamentally wrong. This is the shame complex, the internalized conviction that you are defective at your core. It's not about what you did. It's about what you are. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am the mistake. And once that belief takes root, it colors everything. The psychology begins early. Shame develops when a child is made to feel that their very existence is problematic. Not their behavior, themselves. Maybe they were punished not for what they did, but for who they were. Maybe they were told they were too much, too loud, too sensitive, too difficult. The message wasn't, that action was wrong. It was, you are wrong. And unlike guilt, which can be resolved through apology or repair, shame has no clear path to redemption. Because the problem isn't an action you can fix. It's you. And you can't fix yourself out of being yourself. In social situations, it shows up as hypervigilance. The person is constantly monitoring how they're being perceived, scanning for signs of judgment or rejection. A pause in conversation feels like condemnation. A facial expression feels like proof that they've been found out. They're not paranoid. They're just convinced that if people really saw them, they'd be disgusted. In relationships, shame creates distance. The person can't be vulnerable because vulnerability means exposure. And exposure means the other person will see what they've spent their entire life hiding, that they're fundamentally flawed. So they keep parts of themselves locked away. They perform normalcy. And intimacy becomes impossible because real intimacy requires being seen, and being seen feels like death. At work, it's the person who can't accept compliments. Praise doesn't register as validation. It registers as evidence that they've fooled someone. They're waiting for the moment the facade cracks and people realize they don't belong. Imposter syndrome isn't just doubt. For people with a shame complex, it's certainty. They are imposters, and any success is just proof that they've managed to hide it well enough. The shame complex doesn't just affect individuals. It operates at cultural levels. Societies shame people for their bodies, their desires, their identities. And those who internalize that shame spend their lives trying to shrink, hide, conform. Not because they want to, but because existing as themselves feels unbearable. What makes shame so destructive is that it's self-perpetuating. The person believes they're defective, so they hide. Hiding prevents connection. Lack of connection reinforces the belief that they're unworthy of it. The cycle deepens. And the shame that started as a wound becomes an identity. The difference between healthy guilt and toxic shame is this. Guilt can be addressed. You did something wrong, you make amends, you move forward. Shame offers no such resolution. It just sits there, a constant hum of wrongness that no amount of achievement, approval, or reassurance can silence. The shame complex doesn't protect you from judgment. It just ensures that the harshest judge you'll ever face is the one looking back at you in the mirror. Body image complex. You avoid mirrors. Or you seek them out compulsively, checking, analyzing, finding new flaws you missed the last time. Your body isn't just a body. It's evidence, proof that you don't measure up. Every photo is scrutinized. Every reflection is a reminder. And no matter how much you try to fix it, the dissatisfaction never fades. When your worth becomes inseparable from your appearance, that's a body image complex. It's the obsessive preoccupation with perceived physical flaws, and the belief that your value as a person is determined by how closely you match an ideal that's often impossible to achieve. The psychology is rooted in comparison. From a young age, people are taught that appearance matters. Media presents a narrow standard of beauty. Social media amplifies it, and every image you see becomes a measuring stick. You don't just notice the difference. You internalize it as failure. The model in the ad isn't just attractive. She's the standard. And you're the deviation. The complex shows up differently depending on what you fix it on. Some people obsess over weight. Every meal becomes a calculation. Every workout, an attempt to earn the right to exist in your body. The scale isn't just a number. It's a judgment, and the judgment is always guilty. Others fix it on specific features: a nose, a jawline, skin, hair. The flaw, real or imagined, becomes the only thing you see. You're convinced everyone else sees it too. That it's the first thing people notice. That it defines how they perceive you. You consider surgery not because you want to, but because you believe it's the only way to be acceptable. Body dysmorphia is the extreme version. The person sees distortions that others don't. They look in the mirror and see something fundamentally wrong, even when objective reality says otherwise. It's not vanity. It's a perceptual disorder, and it can lead to compulsive behavior, excessive grooming, cosmetic procedures, complete social withdrawal. In fitness culture, the body image complex takes a socially acceptable form. The pursuit of the perfect physique becomes all-consuming. Every rep, every meal, every reflection is evaluated against an impossible standard, and the goalpost keeps moving. You hit your target weight, but now your body fat percentage is wrong. You build muscle, but the proportions aren't right. The dissatisfaction is permanent because the ideal is unattainable. Social media makes it worse. Filters, angles, editing. Everyone presents a curated version of themselves, and that curated version becomes the standard. You compare your unfiltered reality to their filtered performance, and you lose. Every time. The damage extends beyond the individual. Industries profit from body image complexes. Diet culture, cosmetic surgery, skincare, fashion. They don't sell products. They sell the idea that you're not enough as you are, but you could be if you just buy this, do this, look like this. And the complex keeps people chasing a finish line that doesn't exist. What makes the body image complex so insidious is that it disguises itself as self-improvement. You're not obsessing. You're just trying to be healthier. You're not dissociating from your body. You're just being disciplined. But underneath the language of wellness is the same belief that your body, as it is wrong. And until you fix it, you're not worthy. The body image complex doesn't make you beautiful. It just makes you obsessed. And the obsession doesn't end when you hit the goal. It just finds a new target. Because the problem was never your body. It was the belief that your body determines your value. Beauty complex. Being beautiful isn't just an advantage. For some, it's the only advantage they believe they have. Intelligence, kindness, competence, those things matter. But beauty is power. And when your entire sense of worth is built on it, the thought of losing it feels like losing everything. This is the beauty complex, the belief that physical attractiveness is your primary source of value. It's not about enjoying being attractive. It's about needing it to feel like you matter. And that need shapes every decision, every relationship, every fear about the future. The psychology often starts with reinforcement. From a young age, beautiful people are treated differently. Doors open. People are kinder, more helpful, more forgiving. Strangers smile. Opportunities appear. And the message is clear: you matter because you're beautiful, not in spite of it. Because of it. For some, beauty becomes the strategy. If people respond to your appearance, you lean into it. You cultivate it. You use it. And it works. Until it doesn't. Because beauty, unlike other forms of capital, is temporary. It fades. And if you've built your entire identity on it, aging becomes an existential crisis. In relationships, the beauty complex creates instability. If you believe your worth is tied to your appearance, you also believe your partner is with you because of it. Which means any sign of aging, any perceived decline, feels like a threat. You're not just getting older. You're becoming less valuable. And the fear that your partner will leave for someone younger, more attractive, becomes constant. In professional settings, it shows up as strategic deployment. The person uses their appearance to gain advantage. And it works. But it also traps them. Because every success gets attributed to looks, not skill. Every promotion feels hollow. And the fear of losing that advantage of being judged on merit alone becomes paralyzing. Hollywood is full of people trapped in beauty complexes. Actors whose careers were built on their looks, who can't transition to character roles because they can't let go of being the romantic lead. Cosmetic procedures pile up. Not because they want to look different. Because they're terrified of looking older, and every wrinkle feels like a career-ending flaw. The beauty industry profits from this. Anti-aging creams, procedures, treatments. The message is always the same: you can fight time. You can stay young, you just need to buy this, do this, invest in this. And the complex keeps people spending, chasing, desperate to hold on to something that was always going to slip away. What makes the beauty complex so tragic is that it robs people of the ability to age with dignity. Aging isn't just a natural process. It's a failure. Every year is a step closer to irrelevance. And the energy that could go into building depth, skill, wisdom, goes instead into preservation. Into fighting a battle that can't be won. And here's the cruelty. People with beauty complexes often don't enjoy being beautiful. They're too afraid of losing it. Every compliment is temporary. Every glance in the mirror is an inspection for decline. They can't appreciate what they have because they're too busy terrifying themselves with what they'll lose. The beauty complex doesn't celebrate beauty. It turns it into a prison. And the person inside is always waiting for the moment when their value expires and they're left with nothing but the question they've been avoiding their entire life. Who am I when I'm not beautiful anymore? Success complex. You hit every milestone. Graduated top of your class. Landed the prestigious job. Made the money. Got the title. And it still doesn't feel like enough. There's always another level, another goal, another benchmark to prove you've made it. But no matter how much you achieve, the feeling of having arrived never comes. This is the success complex. The compulsive need to achieve, not because the goals themselves matter, but because success is the only way you know how to measure your worth. It's not ambition. It's addiction. And the high never lasts. The psychology often begins with conditional love. A child learns that approval comes from achievement. Good grades earn praise. Winning earns affection. Being the best earns validation. The message isn't, "We love you." It's, "We love you when you succeed." And the child internalizes that equation. Success equals worth. Failure equals worthlessness. As an adult, that becomes a treadmill. You achieve something. Feel briefly satisfied. Then immediately shift focus to the next goal. Because stopping feels like stagnation. And stagnation feels like failure. The success complex doesn't allow rest. It just demands more. At work, it's the person who can't turn off. Every weekend is for productivity. Every vacation is interrupted by work emails. They're not passionate. They're compulsive. Because their identity is built entirely on what they accomplish. And if they're not accomplishing, they're not anyone. In relationships, it creates distance. The person is never fully present because there's always something more important to achieve. Dinner with family gets cut short for a work call. Quality time gets sacrificed for career advancement. They're not intentionally neglectful. They just genuinely believe that success matters more than connection. Because success is measurable. Love isn't. The success complex also shows up in how people parent. They push their children the same way they push themselves. Every activity becomes a resume builder. Every grade becomes a referendum on the child's future. They're not trying to harm their kids. They're trying to save them from the terror of being ordinary. Because in their mind, ordinary means worthless. Silicon Valley is full of people with success complexes. The culture celebrates overwork, glorifies burnout, treats rest as weakness. And the people who thrive in that environment are often the ones who can't stop, who measure their value in funding rounds, user growth, exits. They achieve extraordinary things. And they're miserable. Because the goalpost keeps moving. And there's no amount of success that finally makes them feel like they're enough. What makes the success complex so destructive is that it prevents people from enjoying their accomplishments. Every achievement is immediately devalued. You made 1 million. Others have made 10. You got promoted. Someone else got promoted faster. The comparison never ends, and the satisfaction never comes. And here's the trap: the success complex looks like virtue, hard work, ambition, drive. Society rewards it. But underneath, the productivity is a person running from the fear that if they stop, if they're just themselves without the achievements, they'll be revealed as nothing. The success complex doesn't create fulfillment. It creates exhaustion. And the person chasing it spends their entire life reaching for a finish line that doesn't exist, because the race was never about the destination. It was about proving they deserved to exist. Failure complex. Some people don't try because they're already convinced they'll fail. The job application never gets submitted. The creative project never gets started. The conversation never happens. Not because of laziness. Because the fear of failure is so overwhelming that avoiding it feels safer than risking it. This is the failure complex. The deep-seated belief that you are destined to fail, so why bother trying? It's not pessimism. It's a defense mechanism. If you never attempt, you never have to face the confirmation of what you already believe, that you're not capable. The psychology often begins with early failure that wasn't processed properly. A child tries something, fails, and instead of being taught that failure is part of learning, they're shamed. Or they internalize the failure as evidence of inadequacy. The brain learns a simple equation: trying equals pain. So it stops trying. As an adult, the failure complex shows up as self-sabotage. You procrastinate on important tasks, not because you don't care, but because delaying means you can still tell yourself you could have succeeded if you'd tried. Actually trying removes that protection. You either succeed, which contradicts the belief but feels temporary, or you fail, which confirms it permanently. In careers, it's the person who stays in jobs they hate, because pursuing what they actually want feels too risky. They tell themselves they're being practical. But underneath the practicality is terror. The fear that if they go after what they want and fail, they'll have to confront the possibility that they weren't good enough. Staying safe means staying small. But it also means avoiding the pain of definitive failure. In relationships, it shows up as avoidance. The person doesn't ask someone out because rejection would confirm what they already suspect, that they're not desirable. They don't pursue deep friendships because abandonment would prove they're not worth staying for. They keep people at a distance not because they don't want connection, but because connection means vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of being proven right about their worthlessness. The failure complex also manifests as perfectionism. If you set the standard impossibly high, you have an excuse when you don't meet it. The project doesn't get finished because it's not perfect yet. The business doesn't launch because the plan isn't flawless. The person isn't procrastinating. They're protecting themselves from the judgment that would come from putting out something less than perfect. But the protection is also a prison. Nothing ever gets done. Athletes with failure complexes choke under pressure. Not because they lack skill, but because the moment becomes about not failing rather than performing. The fear takes over. The body tenses. And the very thing they're trying to avoid becomes inevitable. The failure complex doesn't just predict failure. It creates it. What makes the failure complex so insidious is that it disguises itself as realism. The person isn't avoiding effort. They're just being practical. They're not afraid. They're just aware of their limitations. But underneath the rationalization is a person who's given up before they started. And every year that passes without trying reinforces the belief that they were right to avoid the risk. And here's the cruelty: people with failure complexes often have enormous potential. But the potential stays locked inside, because the risk of proving themselves wrong feels more terrifying than the safety of never knowing what they could have been. The failure complex doesn't protect you from failure. It guarantees it. Because the only way to truly fail is to never try. And that's exactly what the complex demands. Power complex. Control isn't just comforting. For some, it's essential. They need to be in charge. Not because they're qualified, because letting someone else lead feels unbearable. They micromanage. They dominate. They can't delegate, can't collaborate, can't trust anyone else to handle what they believe only they can handle correctly. This is the power complex. The compulsive need to control situations, people, and outcomes. It's not about leadership. It's about dominance. And beneath the need for control is a deep fear of what happens when you don't have it. The psychology centers on anxiety. People with power complexes are terrified of chaos, of unpredictability, of being at someone else's mercy. Control feels like safety. And the more control they have, the less vulnerable they feel. But the need is insatiable. Because no amount of control is ever enough to eliminate the underlying fear. In relationships, it shows up as one person dictating every decision: where to live, how money is spent, who the other person can see. It's not framed as control. It's framed as care, as knowing what's best, as protecting the other person from their own poor judgment. But underneath is the same mechanism: if I control everything, nothing can go wrong. And if nothing goes wrong, I'm safe. At work, it's the manager who can't let go. They assign tasks but then hover, criticize, redo the work themselves because no one else does it right. They don't see this as a failure of delegation. They see it as proof that they're indispensable. But the truth is simpler: they can't tolerate not being in control. And their need for control stifles everyone around them. In families, it becomes authoritarianism. The parent who makes every decision for their children, long past the age when independence should develop. They don't see this as overreach. They see it as responsibility. But the children grow up either unable to make decisions for themselves or desperate to escape the moment they're able. Political leaders with power complexes become autocrats. They can't tolerate dissent because dissent means loss of control. They centralize authority, eliminate checks and balances, and justify it as necessary for stability. But the stability they're protecting isn't the nation's. It's their own. Because losing power feels like annihilation. History is full of rulers who couldn't let go. Leaders who stayed in power long past their effectiveness because stepping down meant admitting they weren't essential. Dictators who destroyed their countries rather than relinquish control. The power complex doesn't care about the greater good. It cares about maintaining dominance. What makes the power complex so destructive is that it prevents growth. You can't learn from others if you believe you're the only one who knows anything. You can't adapt if you refuse to let go of control long enough to see what emerges. The person with a power complex stays rigid, and rigidity in a changing world is a slow collapse. And here's the paradox: the more someone tries to control, the more fragile their position becomes. People resent being controlled. They resist. They leave. And eventually, The person who needed control the most ends up alone, holding power over nothing. The power complex doesn't create strength. It creates isolation, because real power doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from the confidence to let go. And that's the one thing someone with a power complex can never do. Control complex. You rearrange the dishwasher after someone else loads it. You rewrite emails your team already sent. You can't sit in the passenger seat without giving directions. It's not about the dishes or the route. It's about the fact that if you're not controlling it, it feels wrong. When the need to manage every detail extends beyond preference into compulsion, that's a control complex. It's the inability to tolerate uncertainty, variability, or anyone else's way of doing things. And beneath it is a terror so deep that letting go feels like falling. The psychology is rooted in anxiety. For people with control complexes, unpredictability equals danger. As children, they may have lived in chaotic environments where the only way to feel safe was to control what little they could. Or they may have been praised for being responsible, organized, perfect, and learned that control equals love. Either way, the brain wired itself to believe that safety comes from managing everything. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who needs to plan every detail. Where to eat, what to watch, how to spend the weekend. They frame it as being organized or thoughtful. But the real issue is that spontaneity feels threatening. Letting the other person choose means relinquishing control, and that triggers panic. Not conscious panic, just a low-grade discomfort that won't go away until they're back in charge. Financially, it becomes obsessive tracking. Every cent is accounted for. Every purchase is scrutinized. Budgets aren't helpful tools. They're security blankets. And if the numbers don't align perfectly, the anxiety spikes. The person isn't being responsible. They're trying to eliminate all financial unpredictability, which is impossible. But the attempt continues anyway. At work, the control complex turns managers into bottlenecks. They can't delegate because no one else will do it right. They review every email, approve every decision, insert themselves into every process. Their team doesn't grow because growth requires autonomy, and autonomy means loss of control. The manager sees this as diligence. Everyone else sees it as suffocation. In parenting, it becomes helicopter parenting. Every aspect of the child's life is managed. Every risk is eliminated. Every decision is made for them. The parent believes they're protecting their child. But what they're really doing is protecting themselves from the anxiety of not knowing what will happen if they let go. And the child grows up either incapable of independent decision-making or desperate to escape. What makes the control complex so exhausting is that it's never satisfied. You can control your environment, your schedule, your behavior, but you can't control other people. You can't control outcomes. You can't control the future. And the attempt to do so becomes a full-time job that never ends and never succeeds. The irony is that the more someone tries to control, the more chaos they create. People resist being controlled. Plans fall apart. The rigidity that was supposed to create order ends up creating conflict. And the person doubles down, convinced that the problem is that they're not controlling enough, when the real problem is that they're trying to control things that were never controllable in the first place. The control complex doesn't create safety. It creates a prison where the person is both the guard and the inmate, and the bars are made of the terror that, if they ever stop vigilantly managing everything, the world will collapse. But the world won't collapse. It'll just be unpredictable. And for someone with a control complex, that's the same thing. Mother Teresa Complex. There's a certain kind of person who helps everyone. Always available, always generous, always putting others first. And they'll make sure you know about it. Not loudly, just persistently. Every conversation includes a reminder of what they've sacrificed, who they've helped, how much they've given. The help is real. But so is the need for recognition. This is the Mother Teresa complex, named not because Mother Teresa herself had it, but because it represents the image people project selfless, tireless, martyred service to others. Except it's not actually selfless. It's a performance of selflessness designed to earn admiration, moral authority, and immunity from criticism. The psychology is compensation. The person feels unworthy, unimportant, or invisible, so they build an identity around being indispensable. They become the helper, the giver, the one everyone depends on. And through that role, they construct a version of themselves that feels valuable. But the value is contingent on the performance. Stop helping, and the identity collapses. In volunteer work, it shows up as the person who does more than anyone else and makes sure everyone knows. They're at every event. They organize everything. They send updates about their contributions. The work itself matters to them. But what matters more is being seen as the kind of person who does this work. The cause is secondary. The identity is primary. In social circles, they're the friend who's always there when you need them. But if you don't need them, they create need. They offer help you didn't ask for. They insert themselves into your problems. And when you try to handle things yourself, they're hurt, because their role is to be needed. And if you're not needing them, they're not fulfilling the role that makes them feel worthwhile. In families, it's the person who does everything for everyone and resents all of it but won't stop. They martyr themselves for the family, then broadcast their exhaustion. They're not asking for help. They're asking for acknowledgement, for gratitude, for everyone to see how much they sacrifice. And when that acknowledgement doesn't come, or isn't enough, the resentment builds. The Mother Teresa complex differs from genuine altruism in intent. Real altruism is quiet. It doesn't need recognition. It doesn't keep score. The help is given because it's needed, not because the helper needs to be seen as helpful. The Mother Teresa complex, on the other hand, needs witnesses, needs praise, needs everyone to know that they're good, selfless, better than others who don't give as much. Social media amplifies this. Every charitable act becomes a post. Every volunteer hour becomes content. The person frames it as raising awareness, but it's also raising their profile, cultivating an image. And the audience, initially supportive, eventually notices the pattern. The help is real, but so is the self-promotion. What makes the Mother Teresa complex so insidious is that it's socially rewarded. We're told to admire people who sacrifice for others. And the person with the complex leans into that admiration. They don't see themselves as narcissistic. They see themselves as heroes. And anyone who questions their motives gets framed as cynical or ungrateful. But underneath the performance is a person who doesn't believe they have inherent worth, who can only feel valuable by being useful. And the moment they're not needed, the identity crumbles, which is why they can never stop. The helping isn't optional. It's survival. And the recognition isn't vanity. It's the only proof they have that they matter. The Mother Teresa complex doesn't honor service. It weaponizes it. And the person performing it is trapped in a role they can never leave. Because leaving would mean confronting the question they've been avoiding their entire life: am I worth anything if I'm not helping someone? Atlas Complex. You're the one who holds it all together. The family depends on you. The team depends on you. If you stop, everything falls apart. So you don't stop. You carry the weight. You handle the crisis. You solve the problems no one else can solve. And the burden keeps growing. But you can't put it down. Because if you do, who's going to carry it? This is the Atlas Complex, named after the Greek titan condemned to hold up the sky for eternity. It's the belief that you alone are responsible for keeping everything from collapsing. Not because you want to be, because you have to be. And the weight is crushing you, but you can't let go. The psychology begins with early responsibility. Maybe you were the parentified child, the one who had to take care of siblings or manage a dysfunctional household. You learned that if you didn't hold things together, no one would. That belief became permanent. Even when you're no longer in that situation, the pattern remains. You see problems and automatically assume they're yours to fix. In families, it's the person everyone calls in a crisis. Medical emergency, financial trouble, relationship breakdown. You're the one who shows up. You're the one who handles it. And over time, the family stops even trying to manage on their own. Why would they? You'll do it. You always do. And you resent it, but you don't stop. Because stopping would mean watching everything fall apart. At work, it's the employee who can't take time off because they believe the company will fail without them. They're not irreplaceable. They just believe they are. Every project runs through them. Every decision needs their approval. They're not being promoted for this. They're being exploited. But they can't see it because the identity is built on being essential. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who manages everything. Finances, social calendar, household tasks, emotional labor. They don't ask for help because asking feels like admitting failure. And they don't delegate because they believe no one else can handle it properly. The partner becomes dependent. And the person with the Atlas complex becomes exhausted. But they don't stop, because stopping means the relationship collapses. Entrepreneurs with Atlas complexes build businesses they can't step away from. They micromanage every detail. They don't build systems. They are the system. And the business becomes a trap. They can't sell it, can't scale it, can't take a vacation. Because they've structured everything around their indispensability, and the business owns them far more than they own it. The mythology of Atlas is punishment. He didn't choose to hold the sky. He was condemned to it, and people with Atlas complexes often feel the same way. This isn't ambition. It's obligation. They're not carrying the weight because they want to. They're carrying it because they believe they have to. And the belief is so deep that they can't imagine what happens if they put it down. What makes the Atlas complex so destructive is that it prevents growth. You can't build a team if you won't let go. You can't scale if you're the bottleneck. You can't rest if you believe everything depends on you. The weight doesn't just exhaust you. It limits everyone around you. Because as long as you're carrying everything, no one else has the chance to step up. And here's the trap: the moment you start to put the weight down, everyone panics. They've grown dependent. They don't know how to function without you. And their panic confirms what you already believed, that you're the only one who can do this. So, you pick it back up. And the cycle continues. The Atlas complex doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a prisoner of your own belief that the world can't function without you. And the truth is simpler and more painful: the world would adjust. People would step up. Systems would adapt. But as long as you're convinced that letting go equals catastrophe, you'll never find out. Pygmalion Complex. You meet someone and immediately see their potential. Not who they are, but who they could be. With the right guidance, the right influence, the right version of themselves that you can help create. You don't love them for who they are. You love the project, the transformation, the person you're going to turn them into. This is the Pygmalion Complex, named after the Greek myth of a sculptor who carved a statue so perfect he fell in love with it. It's the desire to mold someone into your ideal rather than accepting them as they are. It's not partnership. It's renovation. The psychology centers on control disguised as care. The person with a Pygmalion complex doesn't see their partner, employee, or friend as a complete person. They see raw material. And the relationship becomes about shaping that material into something better. They're not helping you grow. They're remaking you in the image they prefer. In romantic relationships, it shows up as the partner who's always trying to fix you. They critique your wardrobe, suggest new hobbies, push you toward different career paths. They frame it as support. But underneath is the message you're not good enough as you are. The love isn't unconditional. It's provisional, contingent on you becoming the person they've decided you should be. The dynamic is particularly common when there's a perceived imbalance. The older, more successful partner who rescues, the younger, less established one. The intellectual who takes on a protégé, the mentor who becomes romantically involved with the student. The power dynamic makes the transformation feel natural. But it's not mentorship, it's control. In My Fair Lady, Professor Higgins transforms Eliza Doolittle from a flower seller into a refined lady. He's celebrated for it. But the story is also a demonstration of the Pygmalion Complex at work. Higgins doesn't fall in love with Eliza. He falls in love with his own ability to reshape her. She's proof of his skill. And when she finally asserts her independence, he's outraged. Because the creation isn't supposed to develop autonomy. In professional settings, it's the boss who hires for potential rather than fit, then micromanages every aspect of the employee's development. They're not delegating. They're sculpting. The employee isn't given room to grow in their own direction. They're being molded into a specific shape. And if they resist, they're framed as ungrateful or resistant to growth. The Pygmalion Complex isn't always romantic or professional. Parents do it to children. Friends do it to each other. The common thread is the same. The person believes they know better than you do who you should be. And they dedicate themselves to making it happen, whether you want it or not. What makes the Pygmalion Complex so damaging is that it denies the other person's autonomy. You're not being loved. You're being improved. And the moment you stop complying with the transformation, the relationship ends. Because the person didn't actually love you. They loved the project. And if the project isn't cooperating, it's not worth continuing. The tragedy is that some people internalize it. They start to believe that they're only valuable if they're constantly improving, constantly becoming someone else. They lose touch with who they actually are because they've spent so long trying to become who someone else wanted them to be. The Pygmalion Complex isn't love. It's ambition projected onto another person. And the sculpture that results isn't a partner. It's a monument to the sculptor's ego. Jonah Complex. You're on the edge of something big. The opportunity is there. The path is clear. And you sabotage it. Not consciously, but reliably. You miss the deadline. You don't follow up. You downplay your abilities just when someone's about to recognize them. Because success feels more dangerous than failure ever did. This is the Jonah Complex, a term coined by psychologist Abraham Maslow to describe the fear of one's own greatness. It's named after the biblical figure Jonah, who ran from his calling because he didn't want the responsibility of being a prophet. The complex isn't about lacking ability. It's about being terrified of what happens if you actually succeed. The psychology is rooted in fear of consequences. Success brings visibility. Visibility brings judgment. Judgment brings the possibility of being exposed as a fraud. So the person self-sabotages, not because they want to fail, but because failure is safer than the scrutiny that comes with succeeding. In careers, it shows up as chronic underachievement. The talented person who never quite finishes the degree, never quite applies for the promotion, never quite launches the business. They're capable. Everyone sees it. But every time they get close to a breakthrough, they find a reason to pull back. They're not lazy. They're protecting themselves from the terror of having to live up to their potential. In creative fields, it's the writer who never finishes the novel, the musician who never releases the album, the artist who never shows their work. The excuse is perfectionism. But the real issue is fear. Because as long as the work stays unfinished, it can still be perfect in theory. The moment you release it, it becomes real. And real things can be judged, criticized, rejected. The Jonah Complex also shows up as imposter syndrome taken to the extreme. The person achieves something significant, and instead of feeling accomplished, they feel like a fraud who's about to be exposed. They downplay the achievement, attribute it to luck, and when the next opportunity comes, they avoid it because they believe they can't sustain the illusion of competence. Maslow described this as the fear of one's own greatness, not arrogance. The opposite. The person is terrified that if they step into their full potential, they won't be able to handle it, that the responsibility will crush them, that the expectations will be unbearable. So they stay small. Not because they lack ambition, but because smallness feels survivable. Athletes choke at crucial moments not always because of pressure, but because winning means everything changes. You're no longer the underdog. You're the champion. And being the champion means you have to defend the title. It means every future performance is measured against this one. Losing feels easier, so the body complies. The mind freezes, and the opportunity passes. What makes the Jonah Complex so tragic is that it's self-imposed. No one is stopping the person from succeeding. They're stopping themselves, and they know it, which creates a secondary layer of shame. Not only are they not achieving their potential, they're aware that the only obstacle is their own fear. The complex doesn't protect you from failure. It guarantees it, because refusing to try is still a choice, and living below your potential is still a life, just a smaller one. And the person spends their days wondering what could have been, all while knowing that the only thing standing between them and that possibility was their own unwillingness to find out. The Jonah Complex isn't about humility. It's about hiding. And the person stays hidden, safe in the small space they've carved out, convincing themselves that they're fine right where they are, even as the nagging voice in the back of their mind whispers that they were made for more. Cain Complex. Your sibling's success feels like your failure. When they're praised, you feel diminished. When they achieve something, it doesn't inspire you. It threatens you. You're not competing for resources. You're competing for proof that you matter. And every time they win, it feels like evidence that you don't. This is the Cain Complex, named after the biblical story of Cain and Abel, where Cain's jealousy of his brother led to murder. The complex isn't about literal violence. It's about the deep-seated rivalry and resentment that emerges when siblings, or people in sibling-like relationships, can't escape the comparison trap. The psychology begins in childhood. Parents, often unintentionally, create hierarchies. One child is the smart one. The other is the athletic one. One is responsible. The other is creative. The labels seem harmless, but they create roles. And the roles create competition. Because if your sibling excels in the domain that's supposed to define them, and you don't excel in yours, the imbalance feels existential. Parental favoritism accelerates this. When one child receives more attention, more praise, more affection, the other internalizes it as a verdict: you're less. Not less talented, less worthy. And that verdict becomes a lens through which every interaction with the favored sibling is filtered. Their success isn't just their success. It's confirmation of your inadequacy. In adulthood, the Cain Complex shows up as the sibling who can't celebrate the other's achievements. The promotion, the marriage house, each milestone feels like a judgment. And instead of pride or happiness, there's resentment. They don't want their sibling to fail. They just can't stand the feeling of being left behind. The complex extends beyond biological siblings. Coworkers in similar roles develop it. The colleague who started the same day gets promoted first, and instead of motivation, you feel betrayed. Friends in the same field experience it. One publishes a book, and instead of congratulating them, you withdraw. The relationship that should be supportive becomes competitive. In Greek mythology, rivalry between brothers is a recurring theme. Zeus overthrows his father Cronus. Romulus kills Remus to found Rome. These aren't just stories. They're archetypal patterns that show up across cultures because sibling rivalry is universal. The Cain Complex is the psychological manifestation of that archetype. What makes the Cain Complex so destructive is that it poisons relationships that should be sources of support. Siblings, ideally, are your first peers, your allies. But when the complex takes hold, they become rivals. Every family gathering becomes a comparison. Every achievement becomes a competition. And the relationship, which could have been a foundation, becomes a wound. The person with a Cain complex often knows how irrational it is. They know their sibling's success doesn't actually diminish them, but the feeling persists anyway, because it's not rational. It's primal, rooted in the fear that there's only so much love, so much recognition, so much worth to go around. And if your sibling has more, you must have less. The Cain complex doesn't drive achievement. It drives resentment. And the person trapped in it spends their life measuring themselves against someone else, convincing themselves that the comparison matters, when the only person they're really competing with is the version of themselves that could have moved past it. Midas Complex. Everything you touch turns to gold. That's the goal. More money, more assets, more proof that you've made it. But here's the problem: nothing is ever enough. You hit the target, then move the goalpost. The wealth accumulates. The satisfaction doesn't. And the things that used to matter, relationships, rest, meaning, they've all been converted into currency. This is the Midas Complex, named after the Greek king whose wish to turn everything he touched into gold became a curse when he couldn't eat, drink, or embrace his daughter without destroying what he loved. It's the obsession with accumulating wealth to the point where wealth becomes the only measure of worth, and everything else gets sacrificed for it. The psychology often begins with scarcity. People who grew up without money sometimes develop an insatiable need to ensure they never experience that lack again. The fear of poverty becomes so overwhelming that no amount of wealth feels like enough. The bank account grows, but the anxiety doesn't shrink. It just finds new threats to worry about. But the complex isn't limited to people who grew up poor. Sometimes it develops in those who were raised to believe that worth equals net worth. That success is financial. That the scorecard for a life well lived is your portfolio. And once that belief takes root, everything else becomes secondary. In business, it shows up as the entrepreneur who builds a successful company but can't stop. They don't need more money. They have more than they could spend, but stopping feels like failure. So they chase the next deal, the next acquisition, the next zero on the balance sheet. The goal isn't wealth anymore. It's accumulation for its own sake. In relationships, the Midas Complex creates distance. Time is money. And if time is money, spending it on people who don't generate financial return feels like waste. Friendships fade. Family dinners get skipped. The partner becomes an accessory to the lifestyle rather than the reason for it. And when the relationship finally ends, the person is left surrounded by assets and utterly alone. The corporate world rewards the Midas Complex. Executives who prioritize profit over people get promoted. Shareholders celebrate CEOs who cut costs, even when the costs are human. The culture glorifies wealth accumulation and treats everything else as sentimental distraction. And the people who thrive in that environment are often the ones who fully internalize the belief that money is the only thing that matters. Wall Street is full of people with Midas complexes. Traders who make millions but can't enjoy it because they're too busy making more. Hedge fund managers whose entire identity is built on returns. They measure themselves not by what they have, but by what they have relative to others. And the comparison never ends favorably, because there's always someone with more. What makes the Midas Complex so tragic is that it turns success into failure. The person achieves financial security, then financial freedom, then financial excess. But they can't stop. Because the complex isn't about having enough. It's about never having to feel the fear of not having enough. And that fear doesn't go away with wealth. It just gets repackaged. And here's the curse of the things that actually create meaning, connection, love, presence. Those things require time and attention. And time and attention are resources the person with a Midas complex has relocated entirely to wealth generation. By the time they realize what they've lost, the people they loved have moved on, and no amount of gold can bring them back. The Midas complex doesn't create abundance. It creates isolation, and the person dies rich and empty, surrounded by everything they wanted and nothing they needed. Prince Charming Complex. You're waiting for someone to complete you, not compliment you. Complete you. The person who'll swoop in, solve your problems, make you feel whole. You don't need to build a life. You just need to be found. And once you are, everything will fall into place. The career, the happiness, the sense of purpose. It's all tied to finding the right person. This is the Prince Charming Complex, the belief that romantic love will rescue you from yourself. It's the modern version of fairy tale logic. If you're patient, beautiful, deserving enough, your prince will come. And when he does, the story ends happily ever after. Except life isn't a fairy tale. And waiting for rescue means staying stuck. The psychology is rooted in passivity. The person with a Prince Charming complex doesn't take ownership of their life. They wait. They hope. They believe that the right relationship will fix everything that's broken. It's not about partnership. It's about salvation. In dating, it shows up as the person who's always searching for the one, not someone compatible. Someone perfect. Someone who'll make them feel complete. And because no real person can live up to that standard, every relationship ends in disappointment. The partner isn't flawed. They're just not the fantasy. And the fantasy is the only thing that matters. The complex also creates dependency. When you believe someone else is responsible for your happiness, you stop building it yourself. Career ambitions get put on hold until the right person appears. Friendships are treated as placeholders. Life becomes a waiting room, and the person becomes a passenger in their own existence. In romantic comedies, the Prince Charming complex is celebrated. The protagonist's life is a mess until the right person shows up, and everything magically works out. It's fiction. But people internalize it as blueprint, and they spend years waiting for a moment that doesn't exist, while the actual opportunities to build a meaningful life pass them by. The complex isn't limited to women, despite the name. Men develop it too. The belief that finding the right partner will fix their lack of direction, their dissatisfaction, their inability to feel fulfilled. The relationship becomes the solution to problems that have nothing to do with being single. What makes the Prince Charming complex so damaging is that it prevents growth. You can't develop as a person if you're waiting for someone else to develop you. You can't build resilience if you're expecting someone else to be your strength. And you can't create a life worth living if you're convinced that life only starts when someone else enters it. And here's the cruelty. Even if the perfect person shows up, the complex doesn't go away. Because the belief that someone else is responsible for your happiness means that when the inevitable challenges arise, when the relationship requires work, effort, compromise, it feels like betrayal. The prince was supposed to make everything easy. And if he's not, maybe he's not the prince after all. The Prince Charming complex doesn't lead to happily ever after. It leads to a series of failed relationships where the other person is blamed for not being magical enough, while the real problem, the refusal to take responsibility for your own life, never gets addressed. The fairy tale ends when the prince arrives. Real life is what happens after. And if you're still waiting for someone to save you, you'll spend your whole life in the prologue, never realizing the story was always supposed to be yours. Princess Complex. You deserve special treatment. Not because you've earned it, because of who you are. The rules don't apply to you the way they apply to others. You shouldn't have to wait. work, or compromise. You're entitled to the best, and anything less is an insult. When someone believes they're inherently deserving of exceptional treatment without offering anything exceptional in return, that's a princess complex. It's entitlement dressed as self-worth. And it makes every relationship, every job, every interaction a test of whether people recognize your specialness. The psychology often begins with overindulgence. A child raised to believe they're the center of the universe, that their needs always come first, that they're more important than others. The parents meant well. They wanted their child to feel valued. But they created someone who can't function in a world where they're not the priority. In romantic relationships, it shows up as the partner who expects to be pampered but offers little in return. They want grand gestures, expensive gifts, constant attention. But reciprocity doesn't occur to them, because in their mind, being in the relationship is the gift they're giving. Their presence is the reward. And if you don't appreciate it, the problem is yours, not theirs. At work, it's the employee who believes they should be promoted based on potential, not performance. They show up, do the minimum, then resent being passed over. They don't see that others are working harder. They just see that they're not being recognized the way they deserve. And the resentment builds because in their mind, the world is failing to treat them appropriately. In friendships, the princess complex creates imbalance. The person expects their friends to be available, supportive, accommodating. But when those friends need the same, the person is unavailable. Not out of malice, out of genuine belief that their needs are more important. And when friends eventually pull away, the person doesn't reflect on their behavior. They just add it to the list of people who didn't appreciate them. Social media amplifies the princess complex. The culture of influencers and curated perfection creates an environment where people believe they deserve admiration simply for existing beautifully. The content isn't about skill or insight. It's about aesthetic, and the audience is trained to provide validation, which reinforces the belief that being pretty, being aspirational, being invaluable is enough to warrant special treatment. What makes the princess complex so isolating is that it prevents genuine connection. People don't want to be in relationships where they're always giving and never receiving. They don't want to be friends with someone who treats them as servants to their needs. And they don't want to work with colleagues who believe they're above the rules. So the person with a princess complex ends up surrounded by people who either enable the behavior, usually because they're getting something out of it, or people who eventually leave. And the person never understands why. Because to them, they're not demanding. They're just expecting what they deserve. The princess complex isn't confidence. Confidence is earned. It's based on competence, on character, on contribution. The princess complex is entitlement. It's the belief that you deserve the crown without ever having to rule, the throne without ever having to lead, the luxury without ever having to work. And the person trapped in it spends their life waiting for the world to recognize their inherent specialness, never realizing that specialness isn't inherent. It's built. And they never built anything. They just demanded recognition for existing. Mama's Boy Complex. Your mother is the most important woman in your life. Not your partner. Your mother. Every decision runs through her. Every conflict gets mediated by her. And when your partner asks you to prioritize the relationship, you can't. Because prioritizing anyone over your mother feels like betrayal. This is the Mama's Boy Complex. The term used when a man's attachment to his mother is so strong that it prevents him from forming healthy adult relationships. It's not about loving your mother. It's about being unable to function independently from her. The psychology begins with enmeshment. A mother who relied on her son for emotional support, who treated him as a partner rather than a child, who made him feel responsible for her happiness. The son learned that his role is to take care of her. And that role didn't end when he became an adult. It just got more complicated. In romantic relationships, it creates an impossible dynamic. The partner isn't competing with an ex. She's competing with his mother. And she can't win. Because the mother has decades of history, unconditional love, and the advantage of being the woman who's always been there. The partner is the newcomer. And in the son's mind, she needs to earn her place, while his mother's place is permanent. It shows up in 1,000 small ways. He calls his mother every day, multiple times. He asks her opinion on decisions he should be making with his partner. He spends holidays prioritizing her needs over his partner's. He takes her side in conflicts. And when the partner objects, he frames it as her being unreasonable. Because to him, being a good son is non-negotiable. And if she doesn't understand that, she doesn't understand him. The Mama's Boy Complex isn't just about emotional enmeshment. It's often about practical dependence. The mother still does his laundry, cooks his meals, manages his schedule. He's an adult in age, but not in function. And the partner who thought she was entering a relationship with a grown man realizes she's dealing with someone who's still, emotionally and practically, his mother's child. What makes this complex so frustrating for partners is that the man often doesn't see the problem. He thinks he's being respectful, honoring his mother, being a good son. And he is, but he's failing at being a good partner. Because partnership requires separation from the family of origin. It requires building a new primary bond. And the mama's boy can't do that without feeling like he's abandoning his mother. Therapy often uncovers that the mother actively reinforces this. She calls constantly. She inserts herself into the relationship. She makes subtle comments that undermine the partner. Not always consciously. Sometimes she genuinely doesn't realize she's sabotaging her son's relationship. But the effect is the same. The son stays tethered. And the partner either accepts being secondary or she leaves. The Mama's Boy Complex doesn't honor the mother. It traps the son. He never becomes fully independent. He never builds a life that's truly his. He stays in a role that should have ended in adolescence. And every relationship he tries to build is shadowed by the one relationship he can't leave. The partner who stays often ends up resentful. Not of the son. Of the mother. And the son finds himself in the middle, unable to choose because choosing feels impossible. And the relationship that could have been a partnership becomes a triangle where no one is happy. The Mama's Boy Complex doesn't create strong family bonds. It creates weak men who can't stand on their own. And the irony is that the mother, who wanted her son close, often ends up pushing away everyone else, leaving both of them isolated. Daddy Issues Complex. You're attracted to older men. Men in positions of authority. Men who remind you somehow of your father. Or you're attracted to the exact opposite, running from anything that resembles him. Either way, your relationship with your father, or the absence of one, is the template. And every man you meet gets filtered through it. When unresolved issues with your father shape your adult relationships, that's the Daddy Issues Complex. It's not a clinical term. It's cultural shorthand for a real psychological pattern, where the father-daughter relationship, healthy or broken, becomes the blueprint for how you relate to men. The psychology has two main paths. If your father was absent, emotionally or physically, you might spend your life seeking the validation you never got from him. You chase men who are unavailable, emotionally distant, withholding. Not because you enjoy it, but because it's familiar. And part of you believes that if you can make this man stay, this man care, it'll retroactively fix what your father didn't give you. If your father was overbearing, controlling, or abusive, you might do the opposite. You avoid men who resemble him. You're drawn to gentleness, to passivity, to men who won't dominate you. But that avoidance is still a response to him. You're not choosing based on who you are. You're choosing based on what he did. In dating, it shows up as a pattern. The woman who dates men twice her age. Not because of genuine compatibility, but because older men provide the authority, the guidance, the paternal presence she's seeking. The relationship isn't romantic. It's reparative. She's trying to get from a partner what she should have gotten from her father. Or it's the woman who can't trust men at all. Her father broke that trust early, and every man since has been punished for it. She tests them, pushes them away, expects betrayal, and when they eventually leave, it confirms what she already believed: men can't be trusted. She doesn't see that she's engineering the outcome. The daddy issues complex also shows up in how women relate to male authority figures. Bosses, professors, mentors. If the relationship with the father was healthy, these relationships tend to be functional. But if it was broken, the woman either seeks excessive approval from male authority or resents it entirely. The dynamic isn't professional. It's personal, and the male figure, often unaware, becomes a stand-in for the father. Popular culture treats daddy issues as a joke. The woman with daddy issues is promiscuous, unstable, desperate for male attention. It's reductive. The reality is more complicated. It's not about sex. It's about seeking validation, safety, or repair from men who can't provide it because they're not your father. And the thing you're looking for can't be found in romantic relationships. It has to be processed, grieved, and released. What makes the daddy issues complex so persistent is that it operates unconsciously. The woman doesn't choose unavailable men because she wants to suffer. She chooses them because unavailability feels like home. She doesn't chase approval because she's weak. She chases it because she's still trying to earn what should have been given freely. Therapy helps. But only if the person recognizes the pattern. And recognition is hard because it requires admitting that the father, idealized or demonized, still has power over your choices. That decades later you're still reacting to him, and that every relationship you've had has been, in some way, about him. The daddy issues complex doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. But until you confront it, every man you meet will be a ghost of your father. And the relationship you're trying to build will always be haunted by the one you couldn't fix. Rescuer Complex. You see someone struggling and you have to help. Not because they asked. Because you can't stand watching someone suffer when you could do something. You step in. You solve the problem. You carry the weight. And for a moment you feel needed. Valuable. Essential. Until the next person needs saving. And the cycle starts again. When helping people becomes compulsive, when you can't feel worthwhile unless someone needs you, that's the rescuer complex. It's the hero complex focused specifically on saving people from their problems. And underneath the generosity is a person who can't tolerate not being needed. The psychology is driven by identity. For people with rescuer complexes, their sense of self is built entirely on being helpful. They don't know who they are outside of that role. So they seek out people who need help. And if no one needs help, they create situations where help is required. Because being unnecessary feels like non-existence. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who chooses people with problems. Someone struggling with addiction. Someone dealing with trauma. Someone who can't manage their life. The rescuer doesn't see red flags. They see opportunities. This person needs me. And being needed feels like love. But it's not love. It's codependency. The rescuer enables the other person's dysfunction because fixing it would mean losing their purpose. They say they want their partner to get better. But unconsciously, they need their partner to stay broken. Because a healed partner is a partner who doesn't need them anymore. And that's terrifying. At work, it's the colleague who takes on everyone's tasks. Not because they're asked, but because they can't stand seeing others struggle. They work late fixing other people's mistakes. They cover for underperformers. And they justify as being a team player. But what they're really doing is making themselves indispensable by keeping everyone else dependent. In families, the rescuer is the person who bails out the sibling who can't manage money, who houses the relative who won't get their life together, who sacrifices their own stability to prop up everyone else's chaos. They tell themselves it's duty. But it's compulsion, and the people they're rescuing never learn to stand on their own because the rescuer won't let them fall. Emergency responders, social workers, therapists, these professions attract people with rescuer complexes. And in those contexts, the impulse can be channeled productively. But even there, the risk is burnout. Because the rescuer doesn't know how to stop. They don't take care of themselves. They just keep giving until they collapse. What makes the rescuer complex so destructive is that it doesn't actually help people. It keeps them dependent. True help empowers. It gives people tools, then steps back and lets them use those tools. The rescuer complex does the opposite. It solves the problem for them, repeatedly, ensuring they never develop the capacity to solve it themselves. And the rescuer, despite all the helping, ends up resentful. They give, and it's never appreciated enough. Because the giving isn't about the other person. It's about the rescuer's need to be needed, and no amount of gratitude satisfies that need. It just confirms that they're valuable. For now, until the next crisis. The rescuer complex doesn't create strong, capable people. It creates dependence. And the rescuer, who thought they were helping, ends up surrounded by people who can't function without them. Which is exactly what they wanted, and exactly what ensures they'll never feel free. Approval complex. Before you speak, you calculate. Will this make them like me? Will this make them respect me? You adjust your opinion mid-sentence based on how they're reacting. You agree when you don't. You laugh when it's not funny. You shape yourself into whatever you think will earn approval. And the exhaustion of it never ends because the approval never lasts. When your sense of worth depends entirely on external validation, that's an approval complex. It's not about wanting to be liked. Everyone wants that. It's about needing it so desperately that you'll abandon yourself to get it. The psychology begins with conditional love. A child learns that affection comes with conditions. Be good, get love. Be impressive, get attention. Disappoint someone, lose everything. The message isn't you're loved. It's you're loved when you meet expectations, and the child internalizes that. Worth becomes transactional, and the transaction never stops. In social settings, it shows up as chronic people-pleasing. You can't say no. Not because you're generous, but because saying no might make someone upset. And if they're upset, they might not like you. And if they don't like you, you've failed. So you say yes to everything. And your life fills up with commitments you don't want, to people who don't actually care about you. At work, it's the employee who can't handle criticism. Feedback isn't information. It's rejection. A manager pointing out a mistake doesn't feel like guidance. It feels like proof that you're not good enough. And instead of improving, you spiral. Because the approval you were working for has been withdrawn. And without it, you don't know who you are. In relationships, the approval complex makes you a chameleon. You become whoever your partner wants. You suppress your preferences. You agree with their opinions even when you don't share them. You lose yourself in the process of being agreeable. And the relationship isn't real because the person they're with isn't you. It's a performance. And performances don't last. Social media weaponizes the approval complex. Every post is a bid for validation. Every like is a hit of dopamine. Every comment is scrutinized for tone. And the person becomes addicted to the metric, checking compulsively, adjusting their content based on what performs best. They're not sharing their life. They're curating it for approval. And the moment the engagement drops, the anxiety spikes. What makes the approval complex so destructive is that approval from others is unstable. People's opinions shift. What earns praise today gets ignored tomorrow. And because the person's worth is tied to that approval, their sense of self is equally unstable. They're constantly recalibrating, constantly performing, never resting. And here's the cruelty. The people whose approval you're chasing often don't respect the effort. They sense the desperation. And desperation isn't attractive. So the harder you try to earn approval, the less likely you are to get it. And the cycle deepens. The approval complex doesn't make you likable. It makes you exhausting. Because people can tell when you're not being real. And relationships built on performance eventually collapse when the performer gets too tired to keep pretending. Achievement complex. Winning isn't optional. It's the only thing that proves you matter. You don't just want to succeed. You need to. And every achievement, no matter how significant, feels hollow within days. Because the high fades. And all that's left is the pressure to achieve again. When accomplishment becomes the sole measure of worth, that's an achievement complex. It's not ambition. Ambition has goals. The achievement complex has compulsion. And the compulsion is driven by the belief that if you stop achieving, you stop existing. The psychology is rooted in conditional value. Somewhere along the way, the person learned that love, respect, and attention are earned through performance. Good grades earned praise. Winning earned affection. Achieving earned a place at the table. And the lesson stuck. You're not valuable for who you are. You're valuable for what you accomplish. In school, it's the student who can't tolerate anything less than perfect. A single B feels like failure. Not because of the grade itself, but because of what it represents, that they're not the best. And if they're not the best, they're nothing. The stress is relentless. And the perfectionism isn't about excellence. It's about terror. In careers, it shows up as the person who defines themselves entirely by their job title. They work compulsively. 70-hour weeks. No vacations. Because stopping feels like falling behind. And falling behind feels like failure. They're not passionate. They're desperate. Desperate to prove that they're worthy. And the proof is always temporary. In sports, the achievement complex drive athletes to destruction. They push through injuries, sacrifice relationships, burn out young, not because they love the game, but because winning is the only thing that makes them feel like they're enough. When their body finally gives out, they're left with nothing. Because their identity was built entirely on achievement, and achievement requires a body that no longer functions. Olympic athletes often struggle with this. They spend their entire lives working toward a single goal. And when they achieve it, or when they fail, the identity collapses. Because they're not a person who happens to compete. They're a competitor who happens to exist. And when competition ends, existence feels meaningless. What makes the achievement complex so exhausting is that it's never satisfied. You win. Then you need to win again. You get promoted. Then you need the next promotion. The goalpost keeps moving. And the person never gets to rest because rest feels like stagnation, and stagnation feels like death. And here's the trap: the achievements don't actually make the person feel better. They provide temporary relief from the fear of being worthless. But the relief fades fast, and the fear returns, so they chase the next achievement, and the next, and then the next, until they collapse. The achievement complex doesn't create fulfillment. It creates a treadmill, and the person on it is running as fast as they can, terrified that if they stop, they'll discover they were never enough to begin with. Martyrdom Complex. You don't just suffer, you broadcast it. Every hardship becomes a story. Every sacrifice becomes evidence of your goodness. And the subtext is always the same. Look how much I endure. Look what I've given up for you. You don't ask for recognition outright, but you make sure it's impossible to ignore. When suffering becomes a performance designed to earn moral authority, that's a martyrdom complex. It's not about actual sacrifice. It's about weaponizing sacrifice to control, manipulate, and elevate yourself above others. The psychology is transactional. The person with a martyrdom complex keeps score. Every inconvenience is catalogued. Every favor is remembered, and when the time comes, the ledger is presented. You owe me. I suffered for you. And the debt is never repaid because the goal isn't repayment. It's leverage. In families, it's the parent who reminds their children constantly of everything they gave up. The career they didn't pursue. The dreams they abandoned. The life they could have had if not for you. They don't say it to share their experience. They say it to create guilt. And the guilt becomes a tool. Because a child who feels indebted is a child who can't say no. In relationships, it shows up as scorekeeping disguised as love. The partner who does things you didn't ask for, then holds them over you. They cleaned the house, not because they wanted to, but so they could bring it up later. They made a compromise, then turned it into ammunition in the next argument. Every act of care becomes a transaction, and the price is obedience. At work, it's the colleague who takes on excessive responsibility, then broadcasts their exhaustion. They stay late. Work weekends. Skip meals. Not because the job requires it, but because the performance of suffering earns them immunity from criticism. You can't call out someone who's already sacrificing so much. So they suffer, lewdly, and use it as a shield. Religious martyrdom takes this to the extreme. Martyrs throughout history have been celebrated for their willingness to suffer for their beliefs. But the Martyrdom Complex perverts that. It's not about genuine sacrifice. It's about performing sacrifice to achieve sainthood. The person doesn't suffer quietly. They suffer publicly. Because private suffering doesn't earn recognition. And recognition is the goal. Social media turns martyrdom into content. The single parent posting about how hard it is. The caregiver documenting every struggle. The activist performing exhaustion for their cause. Some of it is genuine. But the Martyrdom Complex hijacks suffering and turns it into currency. Sympathy becomes followers. Struggle becomes engagement. And the person stops trying to solve the problem because the problem is their identity. What makes the Martyrdom Complex so insidious is that it looks like virtue. Sacrifice is admirable. Endurance is respected. But the Martyrdom Complex weaponizes both. It turns suffering into a tool for manipulation. And the people around the martyr can never do enough. Because the goal isn't resolution. It's perpetual debt. And here's the cruelty: the martyr genuinely believes they're the victim. They don't see themselves as manipulative. They see themselves as unappreciated. And that belief gives them permission to keep extracting payment for suffering they've often inflicted on themselves. The Martyrdom Complex doesn't honor sacrifice. It exploits it. And the person trapped in it spends their life collecting debts that can never be repaid, wondering why no one ever seems grateful enough. Control Savior Complex. You don't just help people, you save them. On your terms. With your methods. And if they don't follow your instructions exactly, you withdraw. Because this was never about them. It was about you being the one who fixes things. And if they won't let you fix them the way you want to, they don't deserve your help. When the need to rescue combines with the need to dominate, that's a Control Savior Complex. It's the intersection of the Savior Complex and the Control Complex. And it's twice as destructive because it disguises domination as generosity. The psychology is about power. The person needs to be needed. But they also need to be in charge. So they seek out people in crisis, offer help, then use that help as leverage to control every aspect of the situation. They're not empowering the person. They're binding them. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who rescues someone from a difficult situation, then holds it over them forever. They helped you financially, gave you a place to stay, got you out of a bad relationship, and now you owe them. Not gratitude, obedience. Because they didn't save you to set you free. They saved you to own you. The dynamic is particularly toxic because it's framed as love. They frame their control as protection, their dominance as care, and the person being controlled feels guilty for resisting. Because how dare you question someone who saved you? The savior becomes untouchable, and the person they saved becomes trapped. In volunteer work, it's the person who helps but insists on doing it their way. They don't listen to what the community needs. They impose their vision. And if the community resists, they get offended. Because the help was never about service. It was about proving their superiority. And if the people they're helping won't submit to their methods, the help gets withdrawn. The white savior complex is often a control savior complex. The outsider who enters a community assumes they know what's best, implements solutions without consultation, and gets angry when the community doesn't comply. It's not collaboration. It's colonization disguised as charity. In parenting, it becomes suffocating. The parent who micromanages every aspect of the child's life, justifying it as protection. The child isn't allowed to make mistakes because mistakes reflect badly on the parent's ability to control outcomes. And the child grows up either unable to function independently or desperate to escape. What makes the control savior complex so dangerous is that it's socially rewarded. We're told to admire people who help others. And the control savior leans into that admiration. They position themselves as heroes. And anyone who questions their methods gets framed as ungrateful. But underneath the performance is someone who can't tolerate autonomy in others. Who needs people to stay dependent. Who uses generosity as a weapon. And who will abandon anyone who dares to stand on their own. The control savior complex doesn't rescue people. It captures them. And the person doing the rescuing convinces themselves they're the hero, never realizing they've become the captor. Moral superiority complex. You're not just right. You're righteous. And everyone who disagrees with you isn't just wrong. They're bad, immoral, beneath you. You don't engage with opposing views. You judge them. And the judgment feels good because it confirms what you already believe, that you're on the right side, and everyone else is lost. When moral conviction turns into contempt for others, that's a moral superiority complex. It's the belief that your values aren't just your values. They're the only acceptable values, and anyone who doesn't share them is morally deficient. The psychology is rooted in black and white thinking. The person can't tolerate moral ambiguity. Every issue has a right answer and a wrong answer, and they always conveniently hold the right answer. Nuance feels like weakness. Complexity feels like compromise. And compromise feels like betrayal. In politics, it shows up on both sides. The progressive who dismisses anyone less progressive as a bigot. The conservative who frames anyone less traditional as immoral. The libertarian who sees anyone who supports government intervention as authoritarian. The conviction isn't the problem. The contempt is. Online, the moral superiority complex thrives. Social media rewards performative outrage. And the person with the complex leans into it. They don't just disagree with someone. They publicly shame them. They don't engage in dialogue. They attack. And the attacks are framed as moral duty. Because bad people deserve to be called out, and anyone who disagrees is bad. Cancel culture is moral superiority scaled. The belief that someone who has made a mistake, or holds a view you disagree with, should be socially destroyed, not rehabilitated. Destroyed, because the goal isn't correction, it's punishment. And punishment feels righteous. In activism, it becomes purity spirals. The group turns on itself, constantly finding new reasons to declare someone insufficiently committed to the cause. The person who was an ally yesterday is a traitor today because they didn't use the exact right language. The movement eats itself because the moral superiority complex demands perfection. And perfection is impossible. In religion, it's the believer who looks down on everyone outside their faith, who doesn't see non-believers as people with different views, but as people who are lost, broken, damned. The superiority isn't just intellectual. It's existential. They're saved. You're not. And that divide justifies any condescension. What makes the moral superiority complex so destructive is that it prevents growth. You can't learn from people you've already dismissed as immoral. You can't build coalitions with people you see as beneath you. And you can't change minds by treating disagreement as a character flaw. And here's the trap. The person with a moral superiority complex often starts from a place of genuine conviction. They care about justice, about fairness, about doing the right thing. But somewhere along the way, the cause becomes secondary. The primary goal becomes proving that they're better than everyone else. And the activism, the faith, the politics, it all becomes a vehicle for ego. The moral superiority complex doesn't create change. It creates division. And the person wielding it ends up isolated, surrounded only by people who agree with them completely, convinced they're enlightened, never realizing they've just built an echo chamber where their superiority can never be challenged. Purity complex. You're terrified of contamination. Not physical, moral, ideological. You need to stay pure, untainted by the wrong influences, the wrong people, the wrong thoughts. You police your intake obsessively. You cut off anyone who doesn't meet your standards. And the standards keep getting stricter because purity is never pure enough. When the need for perfection extends to your entire identity, that's a purity complex. It's the obsessive pursuit of an unblemished self and the belief that any deviation, any mistake, any compromise is corruption. The psychology often begins with shame. The person feels fundamentally flawed. So they construct an ideal version of themselves, one that's perfect, pure, beyond reproach. And they spend their life trying to become that ideal. But the ideal is impossible. So the pursuit becomes torture. In diet culture, it shows up as orthorexia. The person doesn't just eat healthy. They're obsessed with eating perfectly. Every ingredient is scrutinized. Every meal is planned. And the moment they eat something pure, they spiral. It's not about health anymore. It's about control. And control over food becomes a substitute for control over everything else they can't manage. In wellness communities, the purity complex drives people to extremes. They don't just avoid toxins. They become convinced that everything is toxic. Vaccines, medication, processed food, the modern world itself. And they retreat into ideologies that promise purity: raw veganism, anti-vax movements, detox culture. The goal isn't health. It's the feeling of being clean. In politics and activism, it becomes ideological purity. The person won't associate with anyone whose views aren't perfectly aligned. They don't build coalitions. They excommunicate. Every disagreement is a litmus test, and failing the test means exile. The movement shrinks. But the person feels righteous, because they've maintained their purity. In religion, the purity complex shows up as legalism. The person doesn't just follow the faith. They obsess over every rule. They judge others for minor deviations. They create hierarchies of holiness, and they convince themselves that their rigidity brings them closer to the divine. But what it really does is isolate them from everyone who doesn't share the narrow interpretation. The purity complex also shows up in relationships. The person who can't tolerate any flaw in their partner, who ends relationships over minor incompatibilities, who's waiting for someone perfect, and who will be waiting forever because perfection doesn't exist. What makes the purity complex so exhausting is that it's never satisfied. You reach one standard of purity and the goalpost moves. You're vegan, but now you need to be raw vegan. You're politically active, but now you need to boycott more companies. You're following the rules, but now there are more rules. The pursuit becomes all-consuming. And here's the tragedy: the purity complex is driven by the belief that you're not good enough as you are. That you need to be cleansed, perfected, purified before you're acceptable. But that belief is the real contamination, and no amount of external purity will fix it. The purity complex doesn't create virtue. It creates rigidity, and the person trapped in it spends their life trying to become something impossible, refusing to accept that being human means being imperfect. And that imperfection isn't corruption. It's just life. Rejection complex. The moment someone doesn't text back immediately, you assume they're done with you. A friend cancels plans and you're convinced they're pulling away. A colleague is quiet in a meeting and you think you've offended them. It's not just sensitivity, it's certainty. You know deep down that everyone will eventually reject you. So you're always waiting for it. When the fear of rejection is so overwhelming that you see it everywhere, even when it's not there, that's a rejection complex. It's not about experiencing rejection. Everyone does. It's about interpreting every neutral event as confirmation that you're being rejected. And that interpretation shapes everything. The psychology often begins with early abandonment. A parent who left, a caregiver who was inconsistent, friendships that ended abruptly. The brain learned a pattern connection is temporary and rejection is inevitable. And that pattern became a lens. Every relationship gets filtered through the expectation of eventual loss. In dating, it shows up as hypersensitivity to any sign of disinterest. Your date checks their phone and you assume they're bored. They don't text for a few hours and you're convinced they're ghosting you. You end relationships preemptively, not because you want to, but because ending it first feels safer than being the one who gets left. In friendships, the rejection complex creates constant testing. You push people away to see if they'll come back. You interpret any distance as abandonment. A friend gets busy with work, and instead of understanding, you take it personally. You assume they're choosing to prioritize other things because you don't matter. And when they sense the accusation in your tone and pull back, it confirms what you already believed. At work, it's the employee who interprets every piece of feedback as rejection. A manager's critique feels like a verdict, you're not good enough. A project reassignment feels like you're being pushed out. You read intention into neutral decisions, convinced that people are looking for reasons to get rid of you. The rejection complex also shows up as rejection sensitivity dysphoria, particularly common in people with ADHD or autism. It's an extreme emotional response to perceived rejection, even when the rejection is imagined. A neutral facial expression gets interpreted as disapproval. A delayed response gets interpreted as intentional exclusion. And the emotional pain is real, even when the rejection isn't. What makes the rejection complex so destructive is that it becomes self-fulfilling. You're so convinced people will reject you that you behave in ways that push them away. You're defensive. You're accusatory. You withdraw before they can. And when they finally do leave, not because they wanted to, but because the relationship became exhausting, you don't see your role in it. You just see more proof that you were right all along. And here's the cruelty: the rejection complex prevents you from experiencing real connection. Because even when people stay, even when they're committed, you don't believe it. You're waiting for the moment they leave. And that waiting poisons the relationship, turning every interaction into evidence of impending abandonment. The rejection complex doesn't protect you from rejection. It guarantees loneliness. Because the fear of being rejected becomes so loud that you reject yourself first, over and over, until you're surrounded by the isolation you were trying to avoid. Dependency Complex. You can't make a decision without consulting someone else. You don't trust your own judgment. You need constant reassurance that you're doing the right thing. And when you're alone, you feel lost. Not just lonely. Incapable. Like you don't know how to function without someone telling you what to do. When you can't exist independently, when your sense of self requires another person to hold it together, that's a dependency complex. It's not about wanting partnership. It's about needing someone else to do the thinking, feeling, and deciding for you. The psychology is rooted in learned helplessness. Somewhere along the way, the person was taught that they can't trust themselves. Maybe they were raised by a controlling parent who made every decision for them. Maybe they were punished for independence. Maybe they internalized the message that they're incapable. And now, as adults, they can't function without external direction. In romantic relationships, it shows up as codependency. The person can't be alone. Not for a night. Not for a weekend. The idea of being without their partner triggers panic. Not because they love them so much, but because they don't know who they are without them. Their identity is entirely built around the relationship. And if the relationship ends, they don't just lose a partner. They lose themselves. Financially, it's the person who won't make any financial decision on their own. They defer to a partner, a parent, a friend. Not because they lack the ability, but because the responsibility feels unbearable. And if the decision turns out poorly, they need someone else to blame. Because taking responsibility would mean admitting they're capable. And capability would mean they don't need dependency anymore. In friendships, it's the person who can't go anywhere alone. Can't eat at a restaurant solo. Can't travel independently. They always need company. Not for enjoyment, but for function. Because being alone feels like being abandoned. And abandonment feels like death. The dependency complex often develops in people who were never allowed to develop autonomy. Helicopter parents who hovered. Overprotective caregivers who solved every problem. The child never learned to trust their own decisions because they were never given the chance to make them. And now, as an adult, they're paralyzed by choice. What makes the dependency complex so damaging is that it prevents growth. You can't develop confidence without testing your own judgment. You can't build resilience without facing challenges alone. And you can't become a complete person if you're always relying on someone else to complete you. And here's the trap: people with dependency complexes often attract partners, friends, or family members who enable it. Because dependency feels like being needed. And being needed feels like love. But it's not love. It's a transaction. And the person providing the dependency gets to feel indispensable, while the dependent person stays trapped in a role they never outgrow. The dependency complex doesn't create security. It creates fragility. Because the moment the person you depend on is unavailable, you collapse. And you spend your life one separation away from total disintegration. Independence complex. You don't need anyone. You've built your entire identity around self-sufficiency. Asking for help feels like weakness. Vulnerability feels like failure. And the idea of depending on someone else, even for a moment, is unbearable. You're not just independent. You're isolated. And you've convinced yourself that isolation is strength. When independence becomes compulsive, when you can't tolerate interdependence, that's an independence complex. It's not about being capable. It's about being terrified of needing anyone. The psychology is often a response to early betrayal. The person learned that depending on others leads to pain. Maybe a parent was unreliable. Maybe they were let down repeatedly. Maybe they had to survive on their own when they should have been cared for. So they built walls. And those walls became their identity. In relationships, it shows up as emotional unavailability. The person can't let anyone in. They keep partners at a distance. They don't share their struggles. They don't ask for support. And when a partner offers help, they reject it. Not because they don't need it, but because needing it feels like surrendering control. And control is the only thing that feels safe. At work, it's the person who won't delegate, who takes on everything themselves, who refuses to collaborate because collaboration requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. They're not being productive. They're being defensive, and the refusal to accept help limits what they can achieve. In friendships, the independence complex creates one-sided relationships. The person is happy to help others, but they never let others help them. They position themselves as the strong one, the reliable one, the one who has it all together. And beneath that performance is someone who's terrified that if they admit they need support, they'll be abandoned. The Independence Complex is particularly common in people who grew up in chaotic or neglectful environments. They learned early that adults couldn't be relied on, so they became self-reliant out of necessity. And that self-reliance, which started as survival, became a cage. Because they can't turn it off. Even when they're safe, even when people are trustworthy, the pattern remains. What makes the Independence Complex so lonely is that it prevents real connection. Intimacy requires vulnerability. Partnership requires interdependence. But the person with an independence complex can't allow either. They stay behind the walls they built, convincing themselves they're strong, never realizing that refusing to need anyone isn't strength. It's fear. And here's the tragedy: the person often doesn't realize how isolated they are until it's too late. Until they're facing a crisis and there's no one to call, because they never let anyone close enough to matter. And in that moment, the independence that felt like protection reveals itself as the prison it always was. The independence complex doesn't create strength. It creates loneliness disguised as self-sufficiency. And the person trapped in it spends their life alone, convinced they chose it, never admitting that the choice was made out of terror, not preference. Attention complex. If people aren't looking at you, you feel invisible. If the conversation isn't about you, you redirect it. If someone else is getting praise, you find a way to make it about yourself. You don't just want attention, you need it. And the moment it shifts away from you, you panic. When your sense of existence depends on being the center of focus, that's an attention complex. It's not about confidence or charisma. It's about a desperate need for validation that other people are perceiving you. Because if they're not, you're not sure you exist. The psychology often begins with early neglect or inconsistent attention. A child who was ignored unless they performed, acted out, or achieved something impressive. They learned that attention is conditional, and that being noticed is the only proof that they matter. So they spend their life seeking it. In social settings, it shows up as constant interruption. You can't let someone else finish a story, because that means the focus isn't on you. You one-up every anecdote. Someone shares something difficult, and instead of listening, you pivot to your own experience. Not because you don't care, but because not being the center feels unbearable. On social media, the attention complex thrives. Every post is designed for maximum engagement. Every photo is calculated. The person doesn't share their life. They perform it. And the metrics become a scoreboard. Likes equal worth. Comments equal existence. And a post that doesn't perform triggers an existential crisis. In relationships, it's the partner who can't tolerate their significant other having interests, friendships, or passions that don't involve them. They need to be the priority, always. And if their partner focuses on anything else, it feels like abandonment. The relationship becomes suffocating because one person's need for attention consumes all the oxygen. At work, it's the colleague who dominates every meeting. Who takes credit for group achievements? Who can't let anyone else shine because someone else's success feels like their own invisibility? They're not collaborative. They're competitive. And the competition is always about who gets noticed. Performers, influencers, and public figures often develop attention complexes. The career is built on being seen. And over time, the validation becomes addictive. The applause, the followers, the recognition. It becomes the only thing that feels real. And when it fades, the person doesn't just feel unsuccessful. They feel like they've disappeared. What makes the attention complex so exhausting is that attention from others is never enough. You get it, and the relief is temporary. Then you need more. The threshold keeps rising, And the person becomes trapped in a cycle of seeking validation that can never satisfy because the problem isn't a lack of attention. It's the belief that without it, you don't exist. And here's the trap. The more desperately you seek attention, the less genuine the attention you receive becomes. People perform for you, not with you. They give you focus because you demand it, not because they're genuinely interested. And the attention you're getting isn't connection. It's compliance. Which means it doesn't actually fill the void. It just confirms that you need to keep performing. The attention complex doesn't make you interesting. It makes you exhausting. And the person trapped in it spends their life chasing focus, never realizing that real presence doesn't require an audience. It just requires being comfortable with yourself when no one's watching. Security complex. You can't take risks. Every decision is filtered through worst-case scenarios. You stay in jobs you hate because leaving feels dangerous. You stay in relationships that aren't working because being alone feels riskier. You don't pursue opportunities because the possibility of failure outweighs the possibility of success. And you call it being careful, but it's not caution. It's paralysis. When the need for safety becomes so extreme that it prevents living, that's a security complex. It's the obsessive prioritization of stability over growth, certainty over possibility, and comfort over meaning. The psychology is rooted in fear. Often, the person experienced instability early in life, financial insecurity, unpredictable caregivers, sudden loss. The brain learned that the world is dangerous and that safety is the only thing that matters. And now, even when they're objectively safe, the anxiety remains. So they overcorrect, building their life around eliminating risk, even when that means eliminating opportunity. Financially, it shows up as extreme risk aversion. The person hoards money but won't invest it. They stay in underpaid jobs because the paycheck is guaranteed. They don't start businesses, don't pursue passions, don't take any financial leap because the fear of losing what they have is greater than the desire for something better. And they rationalize it as being responsible. But what they're really doing is staying small to stay safe. In careers, it's the person who won't leave a toxic job because the uncertainty of unemployment feels worse than the certainty of misery. They're not staying out of loyalty. They're staying out of fear. And years pass, and the job drains them. But the thought of stepping into the unknown triggers panic. So they stay. And they call it stability. In relationships, the security complex creates settling. The person stays with a partner they're not compatible with because being in a mediocre relationship feels safer than being single. They don't want to start over. They don't want to risk not finding someone else. So they accept less than they deserve and convince themselves it's enough. The security complex also shows up as resistance to change. New opportunities are threats. Relocation is terrifying. Career shifts are out of the question. The person would rather stay in a familiar situation, even if it's limiting, than face the discomfort of something new. And they justify it by pointing to all the things that could go wrong, never acknowledging all the things that could go right. What makes the security complex so limiting is that it treats safety as the highest value. But safety isn't the same as fulfillment. You can be completely secure and completely miserable. And the person with a security complex often is. Because they've sacrificed growth, meaning, and possibility for the illusion of control. And here's the irony: the security they're chasing doesn't exist. Jobs aren't guaranteed. Relationships can end. Health can fail. The world is unpredictable. And by refusing to take any risk, the person doesn't actually achieve safety. They just guarantee that they'll never experience anything beyond what they already have. The security complex doesn't protect you from danger. It protects you from life. And the person trapped in it spends their years in a cage they built themselves, watching opportunities pass, convincing themselves they're safe, never realizing that the real risk was never trying at all. Recognition Complex. You don't just want to do good work, you want people to see it. You don't help because it feels right. You help because you want credit, and when someone else gets recognized for something you think you deserved, it's not just disappointing. It's infuriating. Because recognition isn't a bonus. It's the whole point. When external acknowledgement becomes the primary motivator, when effort without recognition feels worthless, that's a recognition complex. It's not about being proud of your work. It's about needing other people to validate that your work, and by extension you matter. The psychology begins with conditional validation. A child who only received praise for achievements, not for who they were. They learned that their value was tied to performance. And performance only counts if someone sees it. So they spend their life seeking witnesses. Because unobserved effort doesn't feel real. At work, it shows up as credit seeking. The person doesn't just complete tasks. They make sure everyone knows they completed them. They send update emails. They mention their contributions in meetings. And if someone else gets credit for work they were involved in, they're furious. Not because they care about fairness. Because they need the recognition to feel like the work mattered. In creative fields, it's the artist who can't create without an audience. The musician who won't practice unless someone's listening. The writer who can't finish a project because if no one's going to read it, what's the point? The work itself doesn't provide satisfaction. Only the recognition does. In volunteer work and activism, the recognition complex becomes performance. The person posts every act of service, documents every contribution, frames their activism as personal sacrifice. And the cause becomes secondary to the image of being someone who cares. They're not helping to help. They're helping to be seen as helpful. The recognition complex is particularly prevalent in industries built on visibility: entertainment, social media, academia. The whole structure rewards those who are seen. And people internalize that. Success isn't about the quality of the work. It's about whether the work gets noticed. And if it doesn't, it's treated as failure, even when the work itself is excellent. What makes the recognition complex so frustrating is that recognition from others is unpredictable. You can do great work and be ignored. You can do mediocre work and be praised. The complex makes your sense of worth dependent on something you can't control. So you're constantly anxious, constantly seeking validation, constantly devastated when it doesn't come. And here's the trap. The more you chase recognition, the less you focus on the work itself. You start optimizing for visibility rather than quality. You choose projects based on how impressive they'll look, not whether they're meaningful. You become a performer of competence rather than someone who's actually competent. And the work suffers. The recognition complex doesn't make you successful. It makes you dependent. Dependent on applause, on acknowledgement, on external proof that you matter. And the person trapped in it spends their life working for an audience, never developing the internal sense of worth that would let them work for themselves.